Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of what if Deku was born blind? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. Rhythm of the World was something Izuku Midoriya would never tire of listening to. The sweet thump, thump, thump of people dancing and the clear tune of people laughing and having fun never failed to bring a smile to his face. Well, until today anyways. Quirkless. Useless. The first two things were stated clearly by the doctor that sat about 5 feet in front of him. The third was a word that Kaken called him every time he failed to make the jump on whatever forest excursion they were on or when he ran into a tree because he hadn't seen it. Of course, when he'd come home once again with a bruise on his forehead and Izuku mumbling sheepishly about not seeing the tree again, his mother had gotten worried and brought him into the doctor the next day. The doctor had pointed to something on the wall and no matter how hard Izuku tried, he couldn't read what it said even from 2 feet away. In fact, all that was there to him was blackness, a void in which nothing could be seen. The doctor moved around him, his footsteps loud and jarring on the tile floor. He held up strange devices, flipping a switch on them that brightened the void slightly, but revealed no more of the world than he'd ever seen. No more than 20 minutes into the appointment, Izuku Midoriya was declared legally blind. It wasn't until the doctor had taken x-rays of his feet immediately after that he also concluded Izuku was quirkless too. An extra joint was still there in his pinky toe that most people with quirks lacked. At the age of 4, Izuku had a slim chance of developing a quirk, even less so because of his blindness. Many quirks required the use of sight to control properly, and with his blindness, even if he did develop a quirk, it would most likely be too dangerous for him to use it. At this rate, the best solution for little Izuku is to begin learning Braille as to not be behind in schoolwork completely and to get him a cane. Since he's only 4 years old, it wouldn't be optimal to get him a seeing eye dog. If he does need one still when he's older, then I'll send some information your way to be able to get in touch with a trainer. Otherwise, young Izuku here needs to learn how to use a cane properly. Here, the doctor handed her something that rustled. This should help you get started on improving your son's life as he navigates being blind. If you ever have any questions, my door is always open, Ms. Midoriya. He paused for a moment, as if he was waiting for an answer or something else was happening. This always happened to Izuku. He never knew exactly what was happening or what people were doing, and the feeling left a small, ever-growing pit in the middle of his stomach. Maybe if Izuku wasn't blind as the doctor said he was, he'd understand what happened in those quiet moments when someone took a breath and waited patiently for Izuku to do something that he hadn't been clued in about. But as Izuku left the doctor's office, his hand clenched tightly in his mother's as she fretted over every step he took. He felt deep down in his heart that the doctor might have been wrong about at least one thing he'd said. Maybe also the second thing if he was lucky. The world around him was black, but tiny tendrils of white outlined most of the objects around him in a wavering blur of shapes. Izuku could see the cars lined up in rows in the parking lot. He could see the outline of his mother, her hands shaking as white tears dripped down her face. He could see the door handle in front of him as he gripped it and pulled open the car door, sliding into the passenger seat next to his mother. As he shut the door behind him, the world went black for a moment before flickering back to life as his mom turned on the air conditioner. The drive was silent on the way home, his mother's head swiveling constantly towards him as if in worry or sadness, but she said nothing. The sound of tires and honking was the only sound that Izuku could hear, the street muffled by the car's exterior around him. It wasn't until Izuku stepped foot into his house, his hand still clenched tightly in his mother's, that he was suddenly pulled into a bone-crushing hug. "I'm so sorry, Izuku," his mother sobbed out, her body racking in pain as she slowly rocked his unmoving body back and forth. "I don't understand." Izuku's voice sounded tinny and small even to his own ears. "I can still become a hero, right?" His voice wavered on that last word, tears warbling on the edges of his eyes and threatening to spill down if he moved even slightly from where he was or if anyone said another word. His mother's body racked with another sob, her left hand coming to slowly card through his hair in what he assumed was supposed to be comforting, but it only caused the tears to finally spill over, leaving cold trails along his cheeks that stung in the cool air of the air conditioner. "I'm so sorry, Izuku," she whispered into his ear. Was she giving up on him already? But he could still be a hero if he tried hard enough, right? Quirkless or not. Blind or not. Just because he was useless now didn't mean he would stay that way forever, right? The rest of the day passed in a blur of soft hugs, carded hair, and his favorite food for dinner, a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. His mother held his hand throughout this all, stating it as a precaution until she could get him a cane and he learned how to use it properly. Izuku lay quietly in his bed, his eyes open as he watched the white lines hazily outlining his bedroom, lines appearing and disappearing as the air conditioner hummed along above him. He wanted to sleep, but his throat, parched from crying, made it impossible for the silence to lull him to sleep. His bed creaked as Izuku sat up and flung the covers off, the wooden floor cool under his bare feet. The padding of his feet was masked by the buzzing of the house around him. The tumbling of the dryer intertwined with the soft hum of the air conditioner and the tick of the grandfather clock in the living room. The room felt fainter here, as if the white lines had gotten tired and decided to take a break halfway through outlining. Luckily, Izuku had memorized the layout of his house quite a while ago because of this fact, so he ran into nothing as he reached the kitchen. Reaching into one of the lower cabinets, Izuku pulled out a cup, its texture rough against his hands, and slowly patted over to the sink, turning it on and filling the cup up halfway with the cool water. As he tapped the faucet off, he raised the cup up to his lips and took a few swigs of the water, sighing in satisfaction as the scratching in his throat began to lessen. An idea began forming in his brain as he stood in the kitchen. Couldn't he change how useless he was now? He could see well enough, or whatever these white lines were that crawled across his vision whenever his eyes were open, so couldn't he start training now too? There was a little beach about a quarter of a mile from his house, its sandy slopes filled with mountain upon mountain of trash. It would be strange, Izuku thought, for a little boy to be cleaning it up as training. But what better way to be a hero than to help out his city? All Might always said even the smallest deeds can be hero work, and this seems like a pretty good place to start to Izuku. Cleaning the beach shouldn't be too hard, right? At the age of 10 years old, 6 years after Izuku Midoriya had been told he was blind and quirkless, Izuku felt as if he should have accomplished more of his beach cleanup project than this. His cane rapped lightly against the wooden boardwalk as he made his way down to the beach, sunglasses tipped askewly on his nose as his eyes darted around uselessly to try and soak in the mounds of trash surrounding him. He decided at this point that the doctor had been wrong on both accounts, or at least partly wrong on one of them. He was not indeed blind as the doctor had said. Instead, his quirk, which the doctor had also pointed out that he didn't have, created the imagery that he saw every day and navigated by with the extra help of his cane. It wasn't anything as cool as infrared vision, pointed out by the fact that Izuku had yet to see any colors besides the drab blacks and whites that created his world. If he had to guess, as he had numerous times before out of boredom, Izuku would say his quirk had something to do with the weather. The dips in pressure and the wind ruffling his hair created and blurred the lines of the world, pointing out the objects in his daily life. He could see especially well at the beach, where the sea breeze never ceased blowing, a fact that always left a tiny smile on Izuku's face. It made finding even the tiniest objects half buried in the sand a piece of cake to spot amidst the towering piles of rubble. When Izuku was younger and still growing into his quirk as he started his beach cleanup project, he'd always managed to slice his skin with a thin piece of metal or glass that he hadn't detected. Now, however, the details that his quirk filled in were momentous, causing his eyes to dart around as he soaked in all the details, not because he needed his eyes to see, he was still technically blind of course, but because focusing on the task at looking towards those objects with his eyes made it easier to focus on them. It didn't hurt that it also helped with seeming less creepy when he was talking with someone. For some reason, many people's fingers began to twitch out of nervousness when talking to him, or their postures were unnaturally stiff whenever he talked to them while looking off into the distance. Izuku could just feel the pity rolling off of people like that in waves, and he hated it. Hated when someone's head tilted slightly in sympathy as soon as he told them he was blind. Hated the way their spines stiffened in surprise when he stated he was quirkless. Hated the way they always found a way to slink off after that, pace quickening once they assumed they were far enough away that Izuku wouldn't notice. But he always noticed. Every little detail of his black and white world was always noticed by him. How nobody believed him when he said he could see with his quirk, because who would believe a little 4-year-old that had just been told he was blind? How his mother's footsteps had become heavier with guilt for not noticing his predicament earlier. How his classmates jeered at him from afar. The only good thing that had come out of this was that Kaken never tried to push him down anymore or leave him behind. In fact, Kaken had become one of his closest friends after he came back to preschool with a cane in his right hand and his dark sunglasses perched precariously on his nose. While Kaken didn't show it with his tone of voice or the words he said, Izuku could tell by his posture how protective he'd become of his Deku. His shoulders always stiffened when someone was near Izuku, and he'd always walk right in front of Izuku whenever they were in a new setting or one that Izuku didn't visit often. The insults were the same, and Kaken's temper had only grown more explosive, but he knew that Kaken didn't mean a word of what he said. Every snarky comment of Deku and useless left a smile on Izuku's face that only made the other boys stomp away in anger, muttering profusely about idiots that couldn't take an insult even if it slapped them in the face. Izuku folded up his cane and stored it in the backpack slung across his shoulders. He bent down to pick up the broken microwave below him, taking extra care of the warped metal on the sides that could slice his hand open if he wasn't careful. His mind always seemed to wander when he was trying to find a piece of trash he knew he could lift without trouble. Yet as soon as he spotted his target, a mind-numbing calmness stopped whatever tangent his brain had gone off to and instead focused his mind on the task at hand. Hugging the broken microwave as close to his chest as he dared to, Izuku slowly weaved his way through the trash piles, taking care to pay attention for any glass or metal hiding beneath the sand. Just because he wore thick-soled shoes as a precaution against that happening didn't mean it couldn't. He'd sliced the soles of his feet up enough times for that concept to stick in his brain. His eyes darted around as he walked the length of the boardwalk up to the dumpsters he'd convinced one of the garbage men in the city, Hoshino, to set up there just for him to use for cleanup. Apparently being a blind kid with an admirable goal had some perks when he needed something, with the bonus of minimal questions asked most of the time. With a grunt, Izuku heaved the microwave into the dumpster, the twisted hunk of metal crashing loudly into the rest of the trash already in there. Hopefully, Hoshino would have the time to swing by and empty the dumpster. The trash had almost reached the top of the 5-foot-tall container, and leaving the trash on the side was not something Izuku wanted to do. It just left more work for the garbage man that he'd get chewed out for later. Although Hoshino was never truly mad at Izuku for long. He was mostly just disgruntled by the prospect of the extra work of it. Izuku turned around, cane still in his backpack, and traveled back to the mountains of trash on the beach. With every piece of trash he carried over to the dumpster, his limbs became heavier and heavier until he finally called it quits when his stomach let out a loud gurgle of protest and his arms and legs screamed for a break. Reaching into his backpack, Izuku pulled out his cane, the snap of it straightening loud in the soft breeze, and slowly made his way down the boardwalk towards his house. The wind had quieted for the day, leaving him feeling more blind than usual. The occasional white blur of another person walking by startled Izuku and left him anxious to get home. It was at moments like these, when the outlines were gone or when he was sitting in a room with the air dead and unmoving, that he hated being blind. Sure, he wasn't really blind what with his quirk and all, but he really wished sometimes that he could see everything around him with his own eyes and not because of his quirk. Sometimes Izuku wished he'd been born quirkless, but that he could see. At least then he'd have a better chance of achieving his dreams. He'd always wanted to be a hero as long as he could remember. Ever since he'd listened to that first video with All Might. Although he wasn't sure what All Might looked like, listening to him proudly announce his presence in every video Izuku had played always left him feeling safe and content. His interviews were no different. His booming laughter and confident answers made it certain to Midoriya why he was considered the #1 hero. One day, Izuku wanted to be exactly like him. When Izuku got home, his mother was waiting at the door. "It's 5:30, Izuku," she scolded, pulling him into her arms once he got close enough. "You promised no later than 5 when you went to clean the beach. Just because I'm allowing you to. Do this even though you're technically not blind because of your quirk, It still worries me for you to be out this late. What if you don't sense another person sneaking up on you? What if you fall and are injured and I can't find you? It's a dangerous world out there, Izuku, and I'm scared for you. I know, Mom, he said softly. I'm sorry for making you worry. Next time, I'll make sure to bring my braille watch next time. I guess I just forgot to put it on after lunch. Izuku's mouth pulled down into a frown, hand coming up to tangle in his hair as he hung his head in shame. His mother sighed, her hand joining his as she carded through his curly hair. It's all right, sweetie. I just worry about you more than I probably should. I know you're capable of staying safe, but I'm your mom. It's my job to worry. Izuku couldn't argue with that, and he pursed his lips in thought as he considered what to say next. Considering this to be her win of the argument, his mother ruffled his hair one more time before swooping down and kissing him on the cheek. Now shoo. She pushed him gently into the house. Go get washed up for dinner. I don't want to see a speck of dirt on you when you get back. A grin alighted Izuku's face. Well, I certainly don't see any dirt on me. Can I just go eat dinner already? I'm starving, Mom. She pushed him a little harder towards the bathroom, Izuku's laughter causing her own snort to join in. Izuku, you know exactly what I mean. Now, go before your food gets cold, you troublemaker. His mother walked off, swinging her hands and humming softly to herself. It had been quite a while since Izuku had seen his mother this relaxed. Ever since his father had left them to work at a hero agency overseas 4 years ago, his mother's figure had become more and more hunched, her frame filling out not just from age, but from sadness too. It hurt Izuku's heart to see her slowly withering away. Every time she laughed, every time her shoulders untensed, every time she hummed softly in content, they all lessened the hurt in his heart every time she truly felt happiness. It was something he strived for every day and rarely seemed to accomplish. It used to be much easier to make her giggle in excitement or to get her to laugh in surprise. When Izuku was 6, he went through a phase of trying to make the ugliest faces he could, knowing he had accomplished his task when she burst out laughing. When Izuku was 7, he tried to come up with the craziest poems he could, and he'd recite them at dinner time, almost always managing at least a snort with every attempt. It was near the time when Izuku had turned 8 that his mother became increasingly harder to cheer up. Izuku wasn't sure why his mother didn't laugh as much anymore. He only hoped it wasn't him that had caused the drastic change in her personality. The air conditioner whirred to life as Izuku's cane hit the frame of the bathroom door with a solid thump. His mother always turned it on when he was home so that he was able to navigate the hallways without the use of his cane. With one quick flick of his wrist, he folded up his cane and stuffed it into his backpack, sliding into the bathroom with ease. Pulling up his sleeves up, Izuku turned on the sink, pumping soap into his hands and scrubbing until his hands felt raw and what he assumed to be squeaky clean. Izuku turned off the sink and padded out of the bathroom, the outline of his house a welcoming sight from the static silence of earlier. The cloying smell of soy sauce filled his nose as he breathed in deeply, bringing a smile to his face. Udon, he called out. Udon, his mother confirmed, her shape appearing around the edge of the kitchen's wall. Her head was tilted the way it usually was when she was happy. It left a warm, fuzzy feeling in Izuku's chest as he carefully made his way over to the dining table and sat down. A few fans already pointed directly at his seat so that he wouldn't accidentally stab himself. It had happened one time when he was 8 and his mom had fretted over the possibility since then, even changing out any knives he had to use for plastic ones. With chopsticks held in one hand and his other curling languidly around his drink, he dipped his chopsticks into the udon noodles and brought them slowly to his mouth, blowing softly to cool them off. After a few seconds, he finally lifted them into his mouth, taking a hearty mouthful and moaning in delight at the burst of taste that met his tongue. It was this that Izuku loved. The little things like perfectly cooked udon noodles and quiet laughs and knowing his mom was happy because of him. The little things that made life worth living weren't always what others believed they should be. At the age of 10 years old, Izuku Midoriya felt that maybe being blind wasn't the worst thing that could have happened to him. Maybe it was exactly what he needed. Midoriya also wants to go to Yui High, correct? Izuku ducked his head as the entire class swiveled to look at him, the brutal sound of their laughter filling his ears. He wanted to crawl into a ball and hide. Was it so bad to have a dream just because he was blind? Kaken growled softly beside him, but said nothing like usual. He never said much in Izuku's defense anymore. Not since they'd entered junior high almost 3 years prior. Instead, he'd ignored Izuku as much as possible, like even being near him was something unthinkable. The bullying had only gotten worse with every passing day. The winters were the worst in Izuku's opinion. Without the air conditioners on, he hadn't been able to detect a thing inside the school, being forced instead to use his cane to navigate the halls. His knees were scraped raw and pulsing with pain from how many times he'd been tripped by the other kids. And every time it happened, their shoulders would shake with suppressed laughter as they snickered out sorry. But they weren't ever sorry. Even if they weren't laughing as they said it, Izuku would still know they'd never be sorry. At 15 years old, in his 3rd year of junior high, Izuku Midoriya was still the same useless, blind kid he'd been since he was 4 years old. At this rate, nothing would change. Izuku blocked out the rest of class after that, keeping his head low as his fingers skirted across the notebook in front of him, his specialized pen writing notes on everything he could remember hearing about heroes. The ink came out in thickened dots, drying out less than a second after touching the paper. His fingertips brushed across the braille, rereading through the information he already had. Kamui Woods. Age, 29. Quirk, lumber. He can generate and control wood from any part of his body. He mostly uses it as a way to bind enemies. Ineffective against fire. Recently found fighting an enlarging quirk villain near Tetouan Station this morning. Used his final move of lacquered chain prison to apprehend the villain, but was interrupted by a new hero that goes by the name of MT Lady. Possible new hero on the rise? The school bell rang, dismissing the class for the rest of the day. Izuku sighed, shoving his pen and notebook into the unzipped pocket of his backpack and unfolding his cane with a flick as he stood up. A white blur suddenly appeared in front of him, shoving him back into his seat. Wadash. You'll never become a hero, Deku. The rough voice of Bakugo Katsuki grated against Izuku's ears. He held Izuku down with one hand, the sound of popping sparks coming from the other. Just because you can see outlines, doesn't mean you aren't still blind. You're more likely to get killed than be helpful in the state you're in. I'm going to be the only person from this crappy place to get in, and I'll become the greatest hero too. You're lucky to have even known me at all. So don't even think about applying to Yui, got it? With one final shove against Izuku's shoulder, Bakugo walked away, sparks now flying from both of his hands. Kaken? Izuku had never seen his childhood friend act that way. After 3 years of silence, all he got was a big screw your dreams speech from Kaken, and for what? So that he could feel better about himself? Izuku already knew that Kaken had everything he'd always wanted. An amazing quirk. Eyes that actually worked. A place in this world. The air felt stale as Izuku walked out of the school and down the streets towards his house. His surroundings were pitch black, and it left Izuku with an anxious, squirming feeling in the pit of his stomach. The only sounds he could make out on the quiet streets was the tapping of his cane and the faint gurgling of the sewer system below. When could Izuku also hear the sewer system? You look like a kid nobody's going to miss. Izuku flailed his head around, hoping for a breeze, but seeing nothing but black still. The faint sound of something slithering up from the ground surrounded him, and the feeling in his gut tightened a little more. He held up his cane, swinging it around frantically. His backpack slipped off his shoulders, crumpling to the ground below. "Stay back," he squeaked out. "Them armed, you know." The person chuckled and something wet trailed down his right cheek. Izuku swung his cane in that direction, but felt no resistance. His heartbeat sped up. Badump, badump, badum 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 badum. Where was this person? "Don't worry. I'm just hijacking your body. Calm down. It'll only hurt for about 45 seconds, then it'll all be over." Something cold and slimy forced its way down Izuku's throat, and he immediately felt tears springing into his eyes. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't see. He couldn't speak. He couldn't do anything. Maybe Izuku couldn't become a hero. If he couldn't even save himself, then he really was a useless, sightless kid that was more of a nuisance than a hero. Izuku's hands scrambled against the sludge, filling his mouth to no avail. This was it, he realized with a shock. This was how he was going to die. Alone with no one but his mom to care that he was gone. If only he'd been able to see the villain and escaped earlier. If only he had a quirk that would help him fend this villain off. If only he wasn't useless. If only. If only. If only. The world went silent. When Izuku came to from a hand lightly tapping his cheek, his throat felt parched and wrecked, as if he'd just gotten a cold. "What's happening?" he croaked out. "Oh good," someone's voice boomed out. "Thought I'd lost you there for a second, kid." Eyes widening, Izuku bolted up, hands fumbling around for his cane as he recognized whose voice it was. Of course he'd meet All Might when he couldn't see a thing from his quirk, and he'd just become knocked unconscious by a villain. His hand finally connected with the head of the cane, and Izuku immediately scrambled up, leaning heavily onto the cane as the world stayed black. Where was the wind when you needed it? All Might, Izuku breathed out, head spinning around as he tried to listen to where the hero was. A booming laugh could be heard to his right, and he immediately swiveled around to the hero's general direction. It's an honor to meet you." "Of course, kid. I'm glad I could save you in time too. Slippery villains like these are always the worst." All Might paused for a second, as if waiting for Izuku to do something. He nearly smacked himself in the forehead. Why hadn't he realized that he was blind? Izuku cleared his throat. His face felt bare without his sunglasses on, and he wondered when he'd dropped them. Was it before or after the Sludge villain had almost killed him? "I'm sorry, but if you're expecting me to do something, I'm not entirely sure what it is, All Might. I'm blind." He waved his free hand in front of his face for emphasis. "So, yeah," Izuku wasn't sure what else to say to explain this. Thankfully, All Might seemed to know exactly what to do. "I'm sorry, my boy," he said sheepishly. "Here, I have your backpack and sunglasses in my hands." Izuku smiled gratefully, reaching out his hands and waiting for All Might to place said objects in them. Once he felt his backpack straps securely in his right hand, he swung it up onto his shoulders, taking his sunglasses next and perching them onto the tip of his nose. "Thank you. It's truly an honor to meet you, sir. I was wondering if you could, answer a question for me?" A breeze blew by then, outlining All Might's form, and he nearly gasped in excitement and the hero's figure was tall and large and foreboding, yet comforting at the same time. It was the body of a hero that people looked up to. It was the opposite of Midoriya's own stunted body. And it was crouching down as if he was ready to speed off, something splattering off the side of his lips in droplets that fell quickly to the ground. "I've got to go drop this villain off to the police. See you around, kid." This could be Izuku's only chance to know. He couldn't let this opportunity slip through his fingers. If he did, Izuku wasn't sure he'd ever get a second chance. Right before All Might leaped into the air, Izuku made a split-second decision that changed his life forever. He lunged for the man's hazy outline of a leg, clutching tightly as All Might took off into the sky. Wadash! The wind whipped through Izuku's curls, outlining the entire space around him in a blur of white that seemed to burst in the darkness. His eyes roved back and forth, the maximized sight too much for his mind. Even after Izuku squeezed his eyes shut, he could still sense everything around him. Why did he do this again? For answers, he told himself firmly. He needed to know, and this was the only way to do it. Otherwise, he was bound to stay useless forever. And that was something he truly didn't want to be. Of course, who in their right mind wanted to be useless or even called that? "Kid." All Might's shocked voice shook Izuku from the trance-like state he'd been in. A rough hand started to shove him off from the hero's leg. Panicking, Izuku's grip tightened, a shocked mumbling bursting from his mouth. "If you push me off now, I'm going to fall to my death." The hand stopped in consideration before finally gripping onto his backpack firmly. "Alright. Let's set you down somewhere then." Another white streak flew from the corner of All Might's mouth. Blood, Izuku realized with dawning horror. Was this from the Sludge villain or something else entirely? The world turned black for a moment as All Might touched down on the roof before flickering back to life again in tiny, white tendrils that flowed with the breeze, outlining the rooftop and the door that led down to the building below them. Realizing this might be the only chance he got, Izuku quickly spoke up before All Might could utter out a word. I'm blind. All my life, the world has been black, save for the occasional white outlines created by my quirk. I can see the world, but only through the help of a stray breeze. Most of the time, I can't see anything and I have to navigate the world with a cane and hope I don't run into anything or anyone. All my life I've been told I'm useless. Without my sight and without a useful quirk, will I ever be able to become a great hero like you? Izuku kept his head bowed low through this whole thing, eyes squeezed tightly shut in fear. Yet only silence greeted his little monologue. He looked up with a start only to find a different figure in front of him. Where's All Might? The figure sighed in a tone that sounded exactly like the other man's voice. This couldn't be All Might, right? Izuku Midoriya was left on the building's rooftop, tears threatening to spill from his eyes. He'd listened to the other's story, of a battle that had left the hero scarred and broken for life. His career had been broken. Broken, but not destroyed. Not destroyed like Izuku's dreams in that moment. All he could hear was that one destroying phrase over and over again in his head in a torturous loop. Without your sight? No, I don't think you can become a hero. Sorry. All Might had said sorry with so much pity and sympathy in his voice that Izuku wanted to scream. Or cry. Or maybe take a nap, he thought tiredly, his arms hanging limply at his sides. His cane lay forgotten on the ground in front of him. Maybe he should just go home, crawl into bed, and try to forget he'd ever dreamed of being a hero. Izuku stooped down and scooped up his cane with a sigh. It was time to go home and figure out what the heck he was supposed to do with his life now. Perhaps he could pick up where he'd left off with his beach cleanup project he'd abandoned a year ago once his mother started fretting more after his well-being. Yeah, that was a good start. Taking the stairs down slowly from the building, he finally reached the ground floor. The distant sound of explosions and screaming filled the air, causing Izuku's shoulders to tense. Another villain attack already? But that made 3 today. Izuku turned towards the sounds without a second thought, the wind finally picking up again in the early evening to help him navigate the increasing crowd of people. He stopped on the outskirts of the fight, dread filling his stomach as his quirk filled in the scene before him. A twisting mass wavered in the center of the scene, a hand that was certainly not the mass's own reaching out in panic from it. The tinny crack 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 of explosions sprouted from the hand before blowing up into a massive burst that crashed into the buildings in front of the hand. There was only one person whose quirk sounded like that. Kaken! Izuku screamed out, the panic scratching up his already raw throat. A circle appeared in the mass that Izuku was almost positive now was the Sludge villain that had almost killed him earlier. Kaken's head turned towards him, struggling against the tendrils of white that held him in the sludge. Izuku's eyes darted across the scene uselessly, searching for the heroes that would save his childhood friend. He recognized the outlines of Kamui Woods, Empty Lady, Backdraft, Death Arms, but none of them are stepping forward to save Kaken. He wants to help, but what can he do that the pros can't? His feet seemed to think otherwise as they slowly moved forward, dodging through the crowd faster than his mind could think. Yet it seemed his quirk was keeping in time with his feet and maybe even a little more than that. A different color threaded through the white, streaking the explosions from Kaken's hands and dotting the irises of his eyes. It made throwing his cane at the villain a lot easier to aim without hitting his friend. Then came his sunglasses as he aimed towards the roving circles above Kaken's head that Izuku assumed were the villain's eyes. His backpack fell to the ground behind him as he raked through the sludge surrounding Kaken's body, trying and failing to free him. With another explosion of that new color, Kaken broke his head free for a second, turning towards Izuku and screaming out, "Get out of here, Deku! Stop trying to be the hero!" Then his head was swallowed once again by the sludge. What happened next was a blur of white that filled up his vision and made it impossible to discern between the outlines of the scene. Something solid grabbed a hold of the scruff of his shirt as a powerful wind created a vortex that broke up the sludge until the pieces were only white stakes that confused his quirk and left him blind to whatever had just happened. After a few seconds, the wind died down and was replaced with rain that trailed from the sky in white blurs. Gazing up, Izuku followed the shape of the arm holding onto him tightly and connected it to All Might. He held onto Kaken with his other hand, fingers tensed around the other boy's wrist. Reporters immediately swarmed All Might and Kaken as the hero let go of Izuku and Baku. Izuku was left alone at the side, surrounded himself by the other heroes berating him for being reckless. But what else was he to do? They certainly hadn't been trying to save Kaken. Izuku fled the scene as soon as he could, spotting the outlines of his stuff and scooping it up quickly as he walked back towards his house. This whole day was a mistake. From meeting All Might to thinking for even a second that he could be a hero too. He should have just stayed in bed. I am here in a very weird position. Izuku's head shot up, the shape of All Might appearing before him. The shape condensed a second later as the man coughed up a splat of the new color. Blood, he remembered, but this time it wasn't the stark white from earlier. Maybe he'd ask his mom later what color that was, but for now he need to worry about what exactly All Might wanted. What are you doing here? Izuku asked hesitantly. I'm just the useless kid that got in the way, so you should just go back to your reporters, all right? He saw All Might's hand reached out for a second before falling flat back to his side. No, he huffed out. I was wrong. While all the other heroes hung back and waited for someone else to save young Bakugo, you took the initiative and tried to save him yourself, despite being blind. Most heroes say that their body moved before they could even think, and that's certainly what happened to you back there. You aren't useless, kid. All Might took a deep breath, his smaller form standing tall and proud in the light breeze. You can be a hero. Izuku blinked blearily, rubbing at his eyes as he trudged towards the white mounds of trash on the beach. His cane was tucked carefully into his backpack, the natural sea breeze making it easy to sense his surroundings. A hulking figure stood in the distance, the silhouette now familiar to him as All Might's. He held what Izuku assumed to be a paper pamphlet in his hands, and he almost turned around to go back home right then and there. How dense could this man be? Apparently very dense, as he finally stood in front of the hero who held out the pieces of paper for him. I know we only have 8 months to work on getting you ready for the UE testing, so I decided to make you a plan for dash. I'm blind, Izuku cut in, shifting down his shades and giving the man the most dead look that he could while not knowing where exactly All Might's eyes were. I thought we were already past this, sir. At least All Might had the decency to look embarrassed, he thought wryly. The man ducked his head in shame, the new color he'd seen, red his mom had told him excitedly, outlining his face. It was surprising to say the least. Who knew the symbol of peace was embarrassed so easily? I'll make note of that for future reference, he muttered out. All Might's head swept from side to side as he gazed out at the beach, his mood brightening almost instantly. For now though, you've got a beach to clean and a body to build. The only way your puny body is going to be able to hold my power is by packing these 8 months with hardcore training. Izuku resisted the urge to roll his eyes, knowing the gesture would be lost on All Might from where they hid behind his glasses. Instead, he pursed his lips shut and listened to the rest of his speech, suppressing the urge to scoff at his words. What this man didn't know about him could fill up at least 2 books. Bending down, All Might loomed closer to him and placed a heavy hand on his shoulder. If I'm being honest, this is going to be super tough. Think you're up for the challenge? This time Izuku did scoff, dropping his backpack off his shoulders to the ground and flinging off the slightly large sweater he'd put on earlier to combat the cold morning. Although he couldn't see it, Izuku had a feeling that All Might had a flabbergasted look on his face as he stared at him. He felt his lips curling into a mischievous smirk as he stood there, his workout tank top tight against what was clearly a chiseled chest. His arms were just as muscular, if not more so than his chest, and his legs were of the same hardened mass. Overall, puny didn't quite describe what Izuku looked like one bit. If I'm going to be honest, sir, Izuku chuckled out. I've been cleaning this beach up slowly since I was 5 years old, and all that's left is what my mom wouldn't let me clean up from a year ago. It turns out that being a blind kid leaves a lot of extra time to work out without being disturbed by anyone else. All Might's head tilted to the side in question. Why would a young kid like you want to work out when you could be doing a number of things that are more fun? I've always wanted to be a hero. Izuku said this simply, as if no other dream existed for his future. And it was true. He'd never once thought that he would be anything else, and now that his dreams had even a smidgen of a chance to come true. Izuku couldn't have been happier if he tried. All Might cleared his throat, hands resting lightly on his hips as his face turned towards Izuku and his posture changed into something resembling confidence. And that is what we will make you. With how your body is right now, I believe that cleaning up the rest of this beach will take only 3 of the 8 months we have until the entrance exams. Now, I hadn't planned to do this, but I think you'll be ready to take on my quirk by then and we can work on adjusting the quirk to your body with minimal damage to it in time for the exams. I believe in you, young Midoriya. And that was that. For the next 3 months, Izuku cleaned up the rest of the beach. He pushed cars and pulled sacks of glass to the dumpster he'd gotten put there back when he was a little kid with big dreams of cleaning this beach up and becoming a hero, as if cleaning a beach up could automatically make someone a hero. More than once, glass had gotten stuck into the soles of his shoes and occasionally pierced the tougher skin on the bottom of his feet, always on the days when he was deep into the maze of trash and hidden from the wind. He wished there was a way to create his own wind and prevent these ridiculous injuries. To see on his own without the constant need for an air conditioner or the occasional breeze. And maybe with All Might, with inheriting one for all. Well, maybe he could. The concept of being able to pass on a quirk had astounded Izuku and taken him a few moments to wrap his head around. One for all. A power that was passed from user to user, accumulating power with each new owner of it. How would the power change if combined with his own wind-sensing quirk? On a breezy summer day, when the beach was almost spotless, Izuku decided to ask All Might just that. The man stopped for a moment, before turning back towards him and answering, "I'm not entirely sure. Would you like to test it out?" Izuku felt a grin curling up his lips as he dumped the microwave in his hand into the dumpster. When the man hummed for a moment, head moving around to take in the remaining trash before replying, "Tomorrow. I have faith you'll be able to clean up the rest of the trash today, young Midoriya. After all, the day is still young. You should have plenty of time to pick up those 3 piles left." A sigh left Izuku as his mouth twisted downward in disappointment. He'd really wanted to start learning now, but he guessed another day of labor was a small price to pay for the possibility of being able to sense and see more. Izuku bent down and picked up the door which he assumed had been part of a refrigerator. Wrapping his arms tightly around the middle of it, careful to avoid any sharp edges and what felt like rust under his fingertips, he started trotting once again towards the dumpster. Just one more day, he thought to himself firmly. One more day and he'd be closer to his dreams than he'd ever been before. Eat this. Exhaustion had taken over Izuku's body and mind by the end of the day, so it took longer than he'd like to admit for All Might's words to sink in. The hero's hand was outstretched, a thin strand of white wavering from it in the wind. Dread filled his stomach as the image and words started to make sense when put together. What? All Might chuckled sheepishly, placing the strand of what was undoubtedly hair into Izuku's hand and closing his fingers around it. Well, to inherit my power, you kind of have to swallow part of my DNA and hair strands are the easiest option? But why do I have to swallow it now? Izuku questioned. Why not tomorrow when the training is supposed to start and you'll be there when the quirk manifests? It takes about 3 hours for the quirk to begin to manifest, so I thought it would be best for you to go home after swallowing the DNA to save us time for training tomorrow. Izuku supposed that did make sense in a way. After all, he did want to spend as much time training as he could. Izuku's eyes concentrated towards the white strand of hair on instinct and he felt his mouth go dry in response. Suck it up, Midoriya. It's only one piece of hair, okay? What? Piece. Carefully placing the hair on his tongue, Izuku swallowed it down in one gulp, a shudder racking through his body. It was done and he wasn't sure how to feel. Only tomorrow, when his training would start, could even begin to help him sort through whatever this feeling was. Yagi Toshinori stared at his successor's retreating back as he walked down the boardwalk of the beach, each step heavy with exhaustion. Uncertainty and unease crept into his stomach and he wondered if he'd made the right decision on choosing Midoriya Izuku. This wasn't the first time Toshinori had felt apprehensive about Midoriya. Sure, the kid was bright and seemed motivated to become a hero. Heck, the kid had started cleaning the beach up and working out his muscles all the way back when he was 5 years old. If that wasn't dedication, Toshinori wasn't sure what was. With each argument he pitted against the pit in his stomach, however, only grew the seed of doubt bigger and bigger until a tiny sapling of fear had grown in his gut. What if the kid wasn't ready? What if he'd chosen the wrong person to pass on his legacy to? Midoriya was blind for Pete's sake. Was it really the kid's heroism that had Toshinori jumping into action to help Midoriya become a hero, or was it some twisted form of pity? As Midoriya reached the end of the boardwalk, he pulled out his white cane tipped in red from the yellow backpack he always wore on his shoulders. His green hair flopped in the wind as he slowly tapped his way down the street, eventually too far away for Toshinori's eyes to see him. The sight of Midoriya's pale green eyes suddenly flashed in his mind. Despite not being able to see, the kid's eyes were still expressive and earnest and every bit the look of a hero. Toshinori remembered reading something a while back about the eyes being the window to the soul. He'd shrugged it off as just one of those old phrases used to make people feel wiser, but gazing into Midoriya's eyes, he'd felt something tug at his heart. Something that shouted, "Look at me. See me. I'm here." It was a feeling that always left him breathless and curious and wanting to see what would become of such a frail-looking kid all at the same time. Perhaps it was that feeling, one filled with such blinding emotion and want, that had had Toshinori plucking off a piece of his golden-colored hair and handing it out to Midoriya. He felt proud in that moment and certain of his choice. So why did he feel so apprehensive now? If Toshinori had wanted to protect the kid, he shouldn't have approached him the day of the Sludge villain after everything had gone down. He shouldn't have offered his quirk to the boy who already had a quirk and could live without another one. He shouldn't have told Midoriya that he could become a hero. If there was one promise Toshinori had promised to keep to himself though, it was that he wouldn't lie to those who needed the truth. And Midoriya Izuku, a blind 15-year-old kid who showed more courage and bravery than many of the pro-heroes he knew, had needed to hear that truth. Had needed to hear that he wasn't some useless kid that would amount to nothing. No, Midoriya Izuku was someone who Toshinori felt, in the depths of his heart, could become one of the greatest heroes to live. There was just one problem that blocked the kid's way to accomplish that goal. Midoriya was blind, something that seemed like a minor issue in the grand scheme of things, but it was a minor issue that others, mainly villains, would take advantage of if they knew. The kid was pretty good at acting like he wasn't blind, something Toshinori found quite impressive, but there were still moments that it seemed painfully obvious Midoriya couldn't see what was happening. Whenever someone smiled at him or held something out for him to take when it wasn't windy, the boy always stood there patiently with this confused look on his face as if he couldn't fathom what was happening. Hopefully, Toshinori could also work through this problem in some way so that the kid fit in perfectly with the rest of the class and no one found anything amiss. Yes, his first order of business would be to work with Midoriya on how to act normal, while simultaneously teaching the kid how to harness one for all. Toshinori couldn't let him go all out for his first use of the power either. What would the healers at the hospital think if they saw such an injury? He shuddered to even think about how much they'd chew him out for recklessness, especially if it was Recovery Girl who attended to his wounds. No, he'd have to slowly ease Midoriya into this new power. Hopefully the combination of him already having a quirk and his built-up muscle will help to hone his new quirk. If it didn't, well, Toshinori would deal with that if it came to that. Toshinori let out a yawn, smoke surrounding him in wisps as his form decompressed into what he considered his weak civilian form. He needed to get home and rest. Tomorrow was going to be quite the big day after all. Izuku woke up feeling strange. Not the sort of foreboding strange that he always felt creeping up his spine when the wind died down or he was indoors, but the kind where he knew something was different and couldn't put a finger on what exactly it was. The house was silent at 6 o'clock in the morning as Izuku made his way on his room, hastily pulling on his clothes to get to the beach as soon as possible. It wasn't until he was sitting on his bed, cramming his feet into his red outlined shoes, that something dawned on him. He couldn't hear the telltale whirring of the air conditioner or the faint swishing of the fan overhead on his ceiling. The air was completely dead, but his vision certainly wasn't. In fact, it felt more heightened than ever before. Every single twitch of his fingers, every single exhale of his breath left a tiny trail of outlined objects near him. As Izuku stood up from his bed, he felt a faint wave of air push off of himself, creating a pathway to the closed door in front of him. This new way of seeing was exhilarating and overwhelming at the same time. Tiny specks of white dotted the air the way people described stars and the constellations in the sky. It was a sight he'd never seen, yet he knew it must look something like this. Beautiful and hanging perfectly in the still air. As Izuku moved through the hallway as quietly as he could in an attempt to not wake up his mother, the particles of white moved around him to give him space. He giggled at the sight. Later he'd ask All Might what these white specks were, but for now Izuku was content to watch them without knowing what they were or why they were here. Once Izuku was outside, the white specks vanished, leaving a street full of tumbling trash and fluffy white outlines hanging above him that were definitely new. Maybe they were those things called clouds that Kaken used to point out when they were kids, back when Izuku wasn't sure what his childhood friend had been talking about, nodding along to it all the same without even thinking about questioning Kaken. So many new things filled his senses that Izuku stopped for a moment, crouching down right in front of his house and just breathing deeply. Izuku paused as his quirk filled in the outline of All Might jogging towards him in his condensed form. What are you doing here? He called out once the hero was close enough to hear him easily. I thought it would be best to show up at your house. Since you're technically not allowed to use your quirk out in public, I decided it might be best to take you somewhere a bit more private than the beach. It would be a shame if your career ended before it could start due to my own carelessness. All Might let out a low chuckle. I also wasn't sure what state you'd be in with your quirk combining with One for All, so I thought it might be best to meet up here in case there's any trouble. The man's head bobbed up and down as if he was taking in the scene in front of him. The sight must have troubled him as he muttered out a quick, "Good thing I did show up," and clasped his hand onto Izuku's shoulder. "Let's go, young Midoriya. You can tell me what's troubling you along the way. Time is of the essence." Izuku's eyes darted around. He needed to break this useless habit soon, and, finding nothing amiss, he stood up to join All Might, the other's hands still latched firmly onto his shoulder. It was almost like a comfort with the warmth that seeped through his sweater from that small point of contact. It grounded Izuku in the turmoil of the world around him that had sprouted up overnight. "What's wrong?" All Might asked quietly. Izuku hesitated at that. How did he describe this new feeling of excitement and pain rolled into one? "The world's different," he began slowly. "It's different and more and overwhelming." He paused for a second to gulp down the extra saliva that had filled his mouth in his nervousness. "I don't know what to look at or where to direct my attention to or even what half of what I'm seeing is. Every time I move, a thin wave of air exudes from my body and I see things that would normally take an air conditioner or strong wind to see, but only take a second now. And the puffs in the sky. I think they're clouds? I've never seen them before, but now that my quirk's been combined with One for All, it's like I'm seeing a whole new layer to the world that I've never been able to sense before. How do you survive? Seeing all these different parts of the world and focusing on just one thing at a time? It feels impossible." Frustration had crept into Izuku's voice as he spoke. How did everyone else watch the world go by and not become overwhelmed by the sight of it all? He wanted to focus on every single thing all at the same time, but different objects kept pulling at his attention, nudging until he finally set his quirk to focus on that object. His attention kept jumping and jumping and jumping until his head was spinning and he just had to focus on taking one step after another without running into anything or anyone. It had been so easy to focus on the bigger picture his quirk showed him before, so why was now so different? "I have a friend whose quirk used to overwhelm her." Izuku started at the sound of All Might's voice and how soft it sounded. "You see, she has an information quirk that constantly floods her with facts about the world around her and she used to become overwhelmed to the point that she couldn't move for a while. Eventually she started to realize that she shouldn't try to focus on one thing at a time and bounce from fact to fact, but instead to just let it wash over her and to accept every piece of information as equally important. She built a world of information around her until everything fell into place with her quirk and she no longer felt overwhelmed with all the new information flooding into her mind." All Might turned his head toward Izuku. "Do you think that you can try to do that too? Accept all the information as one and see the bigger picture as just one big puzzle to put together?" Izuku took a deep breath, then let the information his quirk was flooding him with just wash over him until he felt like he was drowning. Except he wasn't. The white and red lines felt crisp and steady in the light breeze of the morning. The clouds flew by overhead in a slow, steady pace as early joggers passed by them without a second turn of the head towards them. Birds swooped between the houses and settled on the telephone wires above, ruffling their feathers calmly in the quiet street. He knew he should feel overwhelmed. He knew that he'd never sensed this many objects at one time or that far away without obtaining a pounding headache for his efforts. Yet he felt none of those things. Izuku felt calm as he watched everything around him. He acknowledged his surroundings. He saw every little thing around him with a reverence of awe. Izuku Midoriya saw the world more than he ever had before in his entire 15 years of living, and he didn't panic. His eyes didn't dart out wildly towards every object, and everything felt okay. "Thank you," Izuku whispered out. He felt All Might's hand, still on his shoulder, squeeze softly in response. It was nothing. No, Izuku wanted to shout out. It wasn't nothing. None of what All Might had done for him was nothing. It was everything in Izuku's eyes. But Izuku's tongue knotted up and his jaw locked up tight, so he said nothing, staring ahead of him at nothing as they walked side by side down the street. One day, he told himself firmly. One day he'd tell All Might just how much he'd done for Izuku, but today was not that day. Today, he took one more step closer to becoming a hero. Yui High School was a large, formidable-looking building with its high-gated entrance and facilities that Izuku could sense went on for quite a few miles. The wind weaved through the students as they made their way through the front gates and towards the entrance exams. Izuku was glad that the weather had decided to comply today. While All Might had been working with him for the past 5 months on his new combined quirk, sometimes it was hard to keep focused when the air was idle and lazy. The swift breeze seemed to concentrate his mind on what to focus on, and his eyes idly followed along in an attempt to look like he was actually able to see. Now, that had been a huge problem in and of itself, Izuku thought wryly. Faking sight was a skill he'd never managed to acquire as a child, too busy with cleaning up the beach and learning Braille to do anything else. All Might had suggested they start training him to fake sight as a precaution against those who might try to use it against him. After mulling it over for a few seconds, Izuku had agreed. It wasn't a useless skill after all. So had begun the 5 months of intense quirk training, now including human gestures and tone inflections. Izuku had run into the problem of determining expressions and mood even after being 2 months into the lesson, so All Might had brought in one of his detective friends to help out. Mr. Tsukachi, or the lie detector as he was better known as, taught Izuku to listen intently for the slight inflections in another's tone to determine their mood and how to read body language with the outlined forms that Izuku could see. It was exhausting work, paying even more attention to the littlest details, but he'd finally mastered the basics the day before. And none too soon too, he thought, as someone bumped into him and began to apologize profusely without stop. In most cases, Izuku would have let them go on as he shuffled on his feet nervously, but with his new skill drilled into him, Izuku had a faint idea of what to do. "It's fine," he cut in bluntly, flashing the person a tiny smile. "No harm done yet?" The other person let out an audible sigh of relief, their long hair wavering slightly from the puff of air. "As long as you're sure." Their voice was raspy and scratched like an old record, but still held a feminine air to it. The girl held out her hand to Izuku, and it took him a moment to focus in on exactly where it was and firmly grip it with his own. "I'm Freya Stellar. It's nice to meet you." Izuku widened his smile in what he hoped was an appropriate response. "I'm Midoriya Izuku. It's nice to meet you too. Out of curiosity, are you from a different country? Forgive me if I'm wrong, but your accent sounds a bit different." Freya laughed. "If my blonde hair and tallness wasn't enough, of course my accent would tip it off," she giggled out. "My brother and I are from the United States. Our mom went here back in her day and she wanted us to at least apply to you. I'm trying for the heroics course and my brother is trying for the support department. How about you?" Her head tilted slightly in what Izuku acknowledged as a questioning manner. "I'm trying for the heroics department as well, although I don't know if I'll make it with my quirk." After a moment of silence, he realized she was waiting for him to explain what he meant. "Oh, well, my quirk is that I can generate air when I move around and sense objects around me with it, so no one can usually sneak up on me from behind. But I'm not sure if I'm strong enough. Oh, she sighed out. I totally understand how you feel. My quirk is called poison control, but it's really the opposite sometimes. It's why I have to wear this mask actually. She wrapped her hand against the front of her face and the sound of metal rang back, surprising Izuku. He hadn't noticed the metal wrapped around the lower half of her face. Well, it's actually a filter, if we're going to be technical. My body naturally pulls off an extra non-metal molecule off of the product compound of whatever gas I'm breathing, so instead of carbon dioxide, I breathe out carbon monoxide. It caused quite a few problems when I was younger. She took a deep breath. I guess I'm rambling a bit, but what I'm trying to say is it's not always your quirk that's going to define whether or not you're strong. Freya. A tall boy with close-cropped hair slowly sidled up to Freya, slinging an arm over her shoulder. The practical exams are about to start. You better go before you're late. Sorry, Ferris, she said sheepishly. It's just, this is the first person that's really talked to me here and I guess I got a little excited and lost track of time. Freya trailed off, body turning half around until she was lined up towards one of the exam doors. She turned her head back slightly and murmured back a quick, "Good luck, Midoriya," and then she was off, her hair floating slightly behind her in the breeze. The other boy, Ferris, turned back towards Midoriya, his head carefully bobbing up and down as he scanned Midoriya from head to toe. Midoriya, huh? Izuku felt as if his throat had suddenly become dry. Had he done something to offend this boy in the literal seconds that they'd met? Weiss, you watch out for my sister, okay? Izuku almost took a step back at the menacing tone the other boy said those words in, but caught himself before he could. She wants to become a hero so badly, always has, and I want to see it come true. Ferris swiveled on his heel and walked towards a different entrance, leaving Izuku confused as to what exactly had happened. But he couldn't dwell on things like that right now. Izuku had a practical exam to pass and a whole lot of people to fool while doing it. Bakugo Katsuki sat impatiently in a crowded lecture room, waiting for the practical exam information with a perpetual scowl gracing his face. All these extras that were laughing and talking with each other just pissed him off. If they wanted to be heroes, it might benefit them to shut the hell up sometimes. Or at least, that's what Katsuki thought. Glancing to his left, he found that the chair next to him was still empty even as the countdown on the screen in front of them stated there was only a minute left until the doors closed and the instructions were given. Of course, the extras that were slackers and late like this one pissed him off even more. As soon as that thought had crossed his mind, the sound of a seat sliding back had his head swiveling back towards the previously empty chair. Empty-looking pale green eyes hidden behind thickly framed glasses met his own, a mop of dark green hair curling along the tops of the boy's eyelids. Katsuki felt his eyes widen considerably in surprise and anger as he stared at Midoriya Izuku. This boy, this insolent kid, fragile and precious his mind whispered out instead, had decided to try out for the heroics department despite what Katsuki had yelled he ashamedly thought, at him. Deku, he hissed out, palms already beginning to sweat nitroglycerin. This boy was going to be the death of him one day. Me, Deku calmly replied back, a vague smile creeping onto his face. Katsuki narrowed his eyes at the messy-haired teen. Where had this sass even come from? The boy he'd known when they were younger had been meek and shy. But this person to his left was a complete stranger. He wasn't even sure when Deku had switched from his traditional sunglasses to regular glasses. And where had his cane gone? You're blind. Smirked. He freaking smirked at Katsuki. Not according to the school application I just sent in. I'm actually just a kid who's extremely clumsy at times and needs high prescription glasses to see. He grasped the side of the glasses frames and lifted them up and down for a few seconds for emphasis. See? Not blind at all. Katsuki slowly let a hissed breath out between his tightly clenched teeth. Just because a paper says something, idiot, doesn't mean it's true. Oh, but it needs to be true, Izuku said nonchalantly. They'd never let a blind kid take this exam, but, he paused for a second, his pale green eyes locking unervingly onto Katsuki's red eyes. How the heck was he even doing that? This kid was blind for Pete's sake. Becoming a hero is my dream, Kaken. Do you really want to destroy that? And the immediate answer was no. Katsuki had never wanted to destroy his dreams or even harm them in any way. He just didn't want his childhood friend to get hurt because of this. Why shouldn't he stop Deku, Izuku, his mind rebelliously whispered, from getting into harm's way? There were no possible outcomes that Katsuki could see where Deku wasn't hurt as a hero. Of course, his mind would argue back, he would also most likely get injured as a hero too, so what was the difference? Deku was blind and Katsuki wasn't. That was the difference and something he always failed to remind himself of. And yet, Deku could see, couldn't he? With that quirk of his, the wind was his guide and could help him sense if anything was coming towards him, no matter the direction. Perhaps he wasn't as weak as Katsuki saw him in his mind's eye. Perhaps, just once, he'd been wrong about Deku not being able to become a hero. Of course, Katsuki would never admit that aloud in a million years. Instead, he let out a small grunt and turned his head to face forward once more as the lights dimmed and the timer went off on the screen in front of them. The sound of people talking slowly pattered off until the only sound left was the occasional shuffling of seats as people tried to get more comfortable. Promise not to say anything about my, impairment? When Katsuki didn't respond after a few seconds, Deku let out a sigh of relief as he took the silence as agreement. It was, but he'd never confirm it. Thanks, Kaken. I knew I could count on you, just like old times. Katsuki peered at Deku out of the corner of his eye, spotting the genuine smile that was now on the other boy's face. All the other smiles had been fake so far. Or, at least not heartfelt like this one was. He felt something akin to happiness beginning to blossom up inside him at that fact, but quickly squashed it down so he could focus on the man standing on the stage. Welcome to today's live performance. A pro hero, Present Mike, screamed out. How's everyone doing today? He flung his fingers out at the audience as if waiting for a response, but the room stayed deathly silent. Present Mike cleared his throat, unfazed by the lack of response. Well, my examinee listeners, I'm here to present the guidelines of your practical. Ready? Yeah. Katsuki swore he could hear crickets chirping in the background. Alright, this is how the test is gonna go down, my listeners. You'll be experiencing 10-minute-long mock battles in a cityscape against. Present Mike paused dramatically for a second, thumping his hands against his legs in lieu of a drum roll. Robots? Robots? Katsuki questioned. How much money does that even cost? The heck? Deku had decidedly ignored his little outburst, much to Katsuki's chagrin. Present Mike continued in the same overly exuberant tone. Bring along whatever your little hero hearts desire. After this little presentation, you'll each head to your assigned testing location. Okay, but let's get right into this. Katsuki tuned out the rest of his speech after the first few sentences. Blah 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 robots. Blah 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 points. 3-pointers are worth more than a measly free throw in basketball after all. Why would robots with giant numbers on them prove to work any differently? Soon enough, the examinees were sent out in buses to their testing sites. Deku, fortunately for the kid, and unfortunately in Katsuki's opinion, was at a different testing site than his. After a brief goodbye, they parted ways onto the separate buses, a nervous yet confident look on Deku's face. Perhaps Katsuki wouldn't have to worry so much about him. Deku seemed to have something up his sleeve and he had a feeling the other boy would be just fine. He had to believe that. After all, Katsuki had his own mock exam to destroy. Burning up robots seemed like a better alternative to destroying his friend's dreams anyways. Izuku's hands itched to hold onto his cane as he stood before the massive cityscape, but that had been tucked carefully in the backpack he'd accidentally left at home. He felt unstable without the reassuring weight of his cane in his hands, but it wasn't a feeling easily rectified in this situation. The wavering outlines of the other examinees surrounded him, making him feel even queasier with the thought of what he had to do. He was going to have to fight giant robots, giant flipping robots, and he was competing against all these other teens who probably had much more useful quirks than his. Sure, Izuku had one for all combined with his own airy eyes quirk, but the power of it had yet to show itself to Izuku, much to his annoyance and despite his efforts to try and summon it. All Might had told him not to be worried about it, that it was because One for All had combined with his own quirk so completely that it would take a lot of dedication and training before the full strength of it manifested. For now, he'd told Izuku that being able to create the semi-powerful whirlwinds from his arms would help him through the exam and that they'd have enough time after Izuku got into Yui to work on improving his combined quirk. Izuku just hoped the whirlwind blast was strong enough to break through metal. Taking a deep breath, Izuku scanned the crowd slowly, letting his gaze focus what he sensed. Many of the people had extended parts to their body as an account to the mutantness of their quirks. There was also quite a lot of people trying to calm down and focus like he was, but those people kept their heads bowed and hands held up above their head as if to pray to one of the gods for help. They wouldn't come, Izuku thought wryly. They never did for him, so why would they come for someone now? A large buzzer sounded over what Izuku assumed were speakers above the cityscape. Go, go, go examinees. In a real battle, there is no countdown to a battle. You have 10 minutes to collect as many points as possible. Good luck. And that was that. The examinees looked at each other for a second before rushing forward in a frenzy. Izuku was left to the back of the pack, which was fine by him. With this quirk, it would be much easier to hunt the robots down, and a few seconds wasn't going to change that fact. As soon as he stepped inside the cityscape, the wind pressure seemed to increase tenfold. A grin curved along Izuku's lips as he started running down a smaller street that all the other examinees had missed, sensing a large object rolling down it on wheels. Pulling back his arm to build up momentum, he ran towards the robot with a determined grin on his face and swept his arm forward in a slicing motion. Izuku heard the tornado of air hit the robot square in the chest, the metal splitting down the middle in a jagged line as the robot fell to the ground in two pieces, the sound of sparks popping off of the wires. Not even a second later, Izuku was already off running. There was no time to do a victory dance over what he'd thought was going to be a complete failure. No, there were robots to destroy and points to rack up. Izuku could distantly sense the wheels and outlines of more robots, so that's where his body took him. Later, Izuku wouldn't recall how many robots his tiny whirlwinds had smashed through nor the satisfying crunch the metal would make as it twisted and fell against the ground. He would recall the deep boom of another robot down the main plaza of the cityscape instead, its giant wheels flinging rocks and debris into the path of the fleeing teenagers. It was the zero-pointer present Mike had told them to avoid and ignore. Izuku was about to do just that, but a cry for help pierced through the foggy panic in his head. He immediately sent a light wave of wind towards the area he'd heard the sound come from, freezing at the sight his quirk unfolded for him. A girl was trapped under one of the earlier destroyed and discarded robot parts. Her right leg melded snugly into the outline of the robot. She cried and cried out for help, but all the other examinees fled the scene, either to escape the robot or to rack up more points or because of both of those options. A sick, twisted feeling curdled inside his stomach. How could all those people hear her asking them for help and do nothing about it? Izuku wasn't sure about them, but the thought of leaving someone who was in danger to deal with it alone seemed rude and unforgiving to him. Without a second thought, his legs began to move on their own towards the larger-than-life robot and the girl about to be crushed below it. As he reached the hunk of metal where the girl was, he pulled back two of his fingers to his left shoulder and aimed the wall of air at the bottom of the metal in an attempt to cut off just the part where the girl's leg was trapped under, angling it just so in an attempt to not collapse the robot onto her more. Releasing his wall of air in a swift downward motion, he sensed the metal cutting cleanly through into a smaller, more manageable piece. He quickly hauled it off of her and held out his hand to help her up. Izuku could practically feel the smile tugging on her face as she quipped out a quick, "Thanks," and then ran away from the giant robot, her hand still enclosed in his for a second before pulling away as she ran off. The speakers came to life with a crackle. "Time's up, examinees. Head to the main gate you first arrived in as soon as you can." His heart seized at that. He'd been so preoccupied saving that girl that he'd forgotten all about how much time was left. Izuku could only hope he'd gotten enough points to pass the exam. If only he could seen the numbers on the sides of the robots and been able to count it up in his head, just as a precaution. But there was a problem he'd forgotten to take into account. Izuku couldn't see or read, so how was he going to take the written portion of the exam? As Midoriya Izuku got off the bus back from the practical exams, his shattered glasses held loosely in his left hand, he made sure to stumble a bit and keep a sheepish look on his face as an examiner overseeing the transition to the written exams came walking over. "Are you okay?" they asked, concern leaking into their voices. Izuku forced out a nervous laugh. "I sorta broke my glasses during the practical exam and my vision is super bad, so I'm not exactly sure how I'm supposed to take the written portion of the exam." Was it convincing enough? Did he seem like a trustworthy enough kid to believe this hastily put-together story? The person nodded in response. "That would pose a slight problem. I suppose that you could take the exam verbally in a separate room." Their voice trailed off uncertainty. Izuku mentally let out a sigh of relief. "That would be perfect, thank you. Follow me then." And so he did, hand fumbling onto the edges of their jacket and holding on tightly as he followed them into the building. Their footsteps echoed with every step they took down the ginormous halls until the examiners stopped in front of an open classroom, empty except for some desks and another person standing with a bored posture at the front of the room. The examiner left him at the door with a quiet, "Good luck." The person's head flicked up as Izuku walked into the room. "So, the man drawled. Or Izuku assumed it was a man from the deeper voice anyways. "Why are you in need of a verbal examination?" Izuku held up his glasses in response, hoping that would be sufficient enough as an answer. The person just sighed in response. "And what is your quirk?" Hesitating for a second, Izuku pondered this question. In the official quirk registry, he'd dubbed the name of his quirk Airy Eyes, but it had become so much more with the combination of one for all. He couldn't keep the man waiting for long though, so he decided to just forego fanciness and try his best to describe his quirk. "I can generate strong air currents when moving my limbs and am also able to sense any object around me for a considerable radius from the wind. It also works to sense objects in just regular wind too, or an air conditioner's current." "Does it also sense words on flat surfaces?" he inquired. If only, Izuku thought wistfully. Instead he responded with a curt, "No, it only senses the outlines of objects." "Name?" "Midoriya Izuku." The man's head nodded once before he gestured to one of the desks in front of him. "Sit down so we can begin." Izuku scrambled to comply, carefully placing the crushed glasses on the desk in front of him. "The test is 112 questions. All of your answers will be verbal and recorded for future grading. If the answer is multiple choice, please state both the letter of the choice and the actual choice itself for clarification. If you would like to skip the question and go back to it after I ask all other questions, please say skip and I will skip it and go back to read that question after all other questions have been read through. You will have 3 hours to complete the verbal version of the entrance exam once I say start. Do you have any questions?" Izuku slowly breathed in, then out. No. He could do this. 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 He could start. Aizawa Shoyuda wasn't sure how exactly he'd gotten stuck with being a verbal testing examiner. With school starting in 3 weeks and his workload piling up over the summer until even staying awake for 3 hours on a free day had been a struggle for him, he wasn't sure if it was to bring the most likely to fall asleep candidate to read a test for 3 freaking hours. Of course, he had a feeling on who it was that recommended him. Hizashi, or more properly known as Present Mike by the public, always seemed to drag Shoyuda into the worst situations possible with a smug grin on his face and the loudest laughter he'd ever heard before from anyone. If Hizashi was seen anywhere in public, Aizawa could usually be found nearby in his yellow sleeping bag, dark circles ever prominent under his eyes. So Shoyuda stood there at the front of his empty classroom in the off possibility that a student couldn't take the written version of the exam, whether this be from an injury or their quirk prevented it. He'd almost just left after standing there with no students showing up for 30 minutes, for he wasn't a very patient person, but some gut feeling told him to wait a few minutes longer and so he did. It had never failed him before and had kept him safe many a times in the field, so why should he ignore it now? Footsteps echoed softly in the hallway after a minute or so of waiting. Shoyuda immediately stood up from where he'd sat down on the teacher's desk, attention focused raptly on the small boy with curly green hair who had walked into the room. The examiner that had brought the boy gave Shoyuta a little wave and then was off once again to oversee some other aspect of the exams. Slowly taking in the appearance of the boy, he felt underwhelmed by the image that looked back at him. With pale green eyes and freckles dotting all along his body combined with his short height and faded clothes, Shoyuta knew he looked twice at this boy if they had passed each other out in public. Perhaps that was why he peered closer at this unassuming teenage boy who, upon closer inspection, shared many of the traits that Aizawa himself had. Deep-set, purple circles surrounded his eyes and eyelids drooped down every few seconds as if he was a second from nodding off. His fingernails were bitten down to the quick and hands shaking excessively. Shoyuta tried to make eye contact with the boy as he walked nervously into the classroom, but his eyes were always off by a few centimeters as his pale eyes aimed everywhere but shut his eyes. So, Shoyuta drawled out, "Why are you in need of a verbal examination?" The boy held up an absolutely wrecked pair of glasses that should have answered his question, but only created more. How did he break his glasses? He didn't look injured and the cracks in the glass looked to be focused on the outside, as if someone had squeezed them too hard and shattered the lenses. Did he break his own glasses then? It didn't make sense, so he decided to ask another question. "And what is your quirk?" Maybe this kid was trying to cheat by using his quirk. Luckily, Shoyuta had read through the list of students trying out and their quirks. If the kid tried to fabricate a quirk, Shoyuta would know immediately. But the quirk the boy described was one that Shoyuta distinctly remembered reading about. An interesting quirk called airy eyes that allowed the user to accurately sense their surroundings from all 360 degrees. The user could also create semi-powerful whirlwinds by moving their limbs. To say it was a strong quirk would be an understatement to say the least. There was one thing that would make it even more powerful and great for reconnaissance. Does it also sense words on flat surfaces? No, it only senses the outlines of objects. The boy's words were laced with pain as he said those words, another fact that left Shoyuta even more confused than before. This boy was getting more and more mysterious the longer they talked. Name? Midoriya Izuku. What a plain name that fit his appearance perfectly. But if Shoyuta was right, and he usually was, there was something more to this ordinary-looking boy. Just needed to find out what exactly that something was. The carpet was bent down in a circular pattern in Izuku's room, courtesy of said boy pacing constantly in the days after the exam had ended. By his calculations, he had barely passed the written part of the exam. The practical part of the exam, however, was a bit trickier to tally up in his head. Izuku wasn't sure how many robots he'd brought down, but something told him it hadn't been enough. What was he going to do if he didn't get in? Fear flashed through Izuku like lightning and his heart stuttered for a moment. He didn't want to let All Might down. If he didn't get into Yui? Well, it was a thought he didn't want to expand any more than he already had, which was a lot if Izuku really thought about it. Izuku had to relax, and what better way to do that than to take a stroll through the city? It was already 11 at night and Izuku knew his mom wouldn't let him leave the house. It was a good thing his bedroom was on the first floor. Pushing his window open, he carefully shimmied through the narrow opening and tumbled into the bushes right under his window, backpack clutched tightly in his left hand. Stopping for a moment outside his window, Izuku reached into his backpack and pulled out his cane and sunglasses. Just because he didn't need to use either of them anymore didn't mean a thing to him. They were like a kid's stuffed animal to him, unnecessary but a security blanket to his fear and anxiety. Besides, who would disturb an armed, canes hurt, person with an upturned hoodie at this hour? He zipped up the backpack again and threw it around his shoulders, ready to take on the city streets. His steps were languid as he walked around the hushed city, the only people on the streets at this hour passing by him without a second glance. It was nice in a way, to be able to go by unnoticed and not cared about for once in his life. And maybe if he got in, Yui would be like that too. No longer would he be looked down upon for being the odd kid out. No longer would he be seen as weak because of who he was and how he'd been born. This would be a new beginning for him and a well-deserved one at that. The bench creaked under him as Izuku finally settled down at the edges of a park, fingers skirting over his braille watch and indicating that it was now midnight. He sagged into the wooden frame, exhaustion finally catching up to his body. Of course this couldn't have occurred when he was at home. No, his body just had to start crashing so far away from his house. As his eyelids started to droop in exhaustion, a silhouette of a boy with hair half outlined in red appeared in front of him. Izuku could hear the voice, the sweet, calming voice, of the other boy, but his mind refused to comprehend it. "Hi," he mumbled out, hand reaching out blindly towards the bright red color. The boy leaned in closer, allowing him to sift his fingers through the red strands. Izuku had never felt anything this soft before in his life. With his last tendrils of consciousness, he heard the boy whisper out, "Hello," before the world went black and Izuku fell into a deep slumber. Izuku dreamed of arms holding him close and cold nipping his scalp as the sensation of fingers carded through his hair. He dreamed of soft pillows and warm blankets wrapped around him like a burrito. He dreamed of peace and calmness and everything soothing that he could think of. His mother's udon noodles and her melodic laughter. Dreams of happiness and light and good. When his eyes began to flutter open and his quirk began to search the surroundings, Izuku felt as if he was still in a dream. The room around him wasn't his. Instead, the objects were more boxy and neat. Not one piece of it felt cluttered or messy in the slightest. "Oh, you're awake?" Izuku startled at the new voice, limbs locking up as his head turned towards the boy standing in the doorway. "I was wondering how long you were going to sleep." "Who are you?" he stammered out through clenched teeth. His hand fumbled out to grasp his cane that had been left leaning against the side of the bed he lay in, bringing the aluminum object up until it was clutched tightly to his chest. The boy let out a soft sigh, creeping closer until he could finally sit on the edge of the bed. His bed probably, Izuku thought with a twisting feeling in his stomach. "I feel as if I should be asking the same question." "Huh. I happened upon you in Tapioca Park, just as your eyelids were fluttering closed. You looked about my age and it didn't feel right to just leave you there. I hope you don't mind that I brought you back to my house. A bed is better for your back to sleep upon than a park bench." What a sensible and sweet boy, Izuku thought, blushing immediately at the thought. Oh, how he wished to be anywhere else but here. "Your name?" Izuku looked up from where he'd buried his face in his hands, a confused look on his face. The boy repeated his question again, this time a little slower. "What's your name?" Izuku hesitated for a second, indecision locking up his lips for a moment before he just shrugged it off. It was just a name after all. "Midoriya Izuku," he muttered out. "Todoroki Shudo," the other boy, Todoroki, responded, reaching out his hand as a friendly gesture. Izuku grasped Todoroki's hand in his own after a moment, fingers squeezing softly against the other boy's in a handshake. A sudden thumping had Todoroki's head whipping up and staring towards the door, his posture now rigid and tense. "You have to go now." Izuku opened his mouth, ready to ask why, to protest, but the other boy quickly cut him off. "There's no time to explain, I'm afraid. Can you climb out through the window and down the lattice with, your visual impairment?" He'd been wondering when that was going to be pointed out. His cane left little to the imagination on that subject. "I'll be fine," Izuku said curtly. "But why do I have to go dash?" "No time." Todoroki pulled Izuku out of bed, carefully placing his shoes and backpack into his lap. "Quickly, put those on and leave. I'll try to stall, but I just hope for your sake that you're gone by the time I get back. Got it?" What was happening? "All right," Izuku stuttered out, pulling on his red outlined shoes. But as the door shut softly behind Todoroki, everything felt like the opposite of all right. This quiet boy who had brought him in out of kindness had sounded so worried and fearful at the mere idea of Izuku being found in his bedroom. It didn't sit well in Izuku's stomach one bit. Backpack straps tightened around his shoulders and shoes snug on his feet, Izuku made his way over to the window and climbed out onto the lattice, climbing up the wall. Flowers creeped between the slatted strips and wove intricate patterns all the way down to the street 2 stories below. He felt nausea climbing up his throat and threatening to spill whatever dinner was still in his stomach, but he swallowed it down without a second thought. He would have time to puke later. Right now, he was carefully pulling the window shut and slowly crawling his way down the vine surface, cautious of what footholds to use as he tried to climb down as quickly as possible. Izuku's feet hit the street below with a soft thud. The park he'd fallen asleep in was right next door to this house, a fact Izuku was grateful of. Turning around, his eyes darted up towards the house one more time before he fled with a brisk pace. Whatever was going to happen next, he had a feeling he wouldn't want to be caught up in it. Hand creeping down to his watch, his fingers felt over the bumps of his watch and a feeling of relief swept over his body. It was only 7 o'clock in the morning, an hour before his mom would even open his bedroom door. If he continued at the pace, he could be home with 15 minutes to spare and a mother who was none wiser of where he'd spent his night. A wistful sigh broke out from Izuku's lips as he walked down the near empty streets. The boy, Todoroki Shudo, hadn't really acted different. He hadn't acted differently even though he probably knew the whole time that Izuku was blind. It was quite nice if he was being honest with himself. Todoroki had treated him as an equal and had trusted him without a second thought when Izuku had said that he would be fine escaping through the window without help. The only other friend Izuku had ever had, Kaken, had never thought of him as independent and strong on his own. No, he'd always seen Izuku as weak and someone to protect. While he couldn't condemn his childhood friend for acting like that, sometimes he wondered if he might have turned out stronger if Kaken hadn't stood up for him. If Izuku would have learned to fight for himself from the beginning instead of being thrust into it in middle school when Kaken had begun to ignore him. Todoroki was the first person Izuku could ever remember meeting that had known he was blind from the beginning and still treated him as an equal. It spoke volumes to him and left a tiny seedling of hope in Izuku's heart that even he couldn't begin to notice and fathom being there. Midoriya Izuku was a hurricane of emotions, and only time would tell if that seedling would continue to grow or wither in the storm. A letter from Yui Academy sat innocently on Izuku's desk. The faint white outline seemed to mock Izuku as his fingers skirted over the top of it, too nervous to open it. A bead of sweat trickled down Izuku's forehead as he let out a tense sigh. He had to open it sometime, but his shaky hands protested that time being now. He wasn't even sure why he was nervous. It was just jumbled up ink on a paper that he couldn't read. It shouldn't make him this anxious. Fingers slipping over the already opened flap once more, Izuku steeled himself and finally reached into the envelope for the letter only to find a small, metallic disc instead. Wadash. Midoriya, my boy. It is I, All Might, with an audio message for you courtesy of Yui Academy. Did that mean? Yes, I am now a teacher here, so I look forward to seeing you here. Izuku's heart stuttered. Was he hearing things, or did he truly just insinuate that he'd gotten in? He heard a nervous chuckle in the background from All Might. Oh, well, I guess that cat's out of the bag. With a villain score of 35 points, you would not have passed. Fortunately, there was another hidden score happening. Points were awarded not only by how many villains one defeated, but there were also rescue points that were hashed out by a panel of judges. With a rescue score of 45 points and a total score of 80, Midoriya Izuku, you passed with the top score of the entire exams. And that's not including your written, or in this case verbal, exam which you also passed with one of the top scores. All Might paused for a second, as if giving Izuku a chance to breathe and really let what he just said sink in. And he really needed that second if he was being honest with himself. Not only had he gotten into Yui, he'd also gotten the top score in the part he thought he'd surely failed. The world glitched around as his elation soared, causing him to pause for a second in surprise. As his heartbeat started to calm down a bit, the world stabilized around him and returned to the once again recognizable shapes of his room. Congratulations, my boy. Welcome to Yui Academy for your Hero Academia. School starts in 2 weeks, so make sure you get what you need for school before then. If you press the top of the metallic disc again, the audio for your school list will play out. Reach for your dream, young Midoriya, and go plus ultra. Izuku pushed the issue of his quirk shaking aside for now as he pushed the top of the metallic disc again. That was a worry for another time, he thought to himself. For now, he had a Hero Academy to get ready for. The front door slammed shut as Todoroki Shudo finally learned the name of the teen he'd brought into his house, and what a lovely name Midoriya Izuku was. He'd seen the boy just sitting at the park bench just 50 feet from his window, and it had brought a strange, swirling emotion in his gut to watch his green hair of curls bob slowly with drowsiness under the streetlight above. Without knowing why, Shudo had felt compelled to climb out the window and ask this mysterious boy his name and maybe a little bit more. He'd been out the window and climbing down the lattice fence of flowers before his mind could register what he was doing or why. Feet softly thudding against the ground, he'd slowly made his way over to the boy, trying not to seem suspicious, but knowing he was probably failing miserably at that. As Shudo's vision finally sharpened on the boy, he noticed a cane hanging loosely in his right hand and sunglasses on the tip of his nose despite it being the middle of the night. Blind, his mind helpfully supplied for him. The boy was blind and out at night with no one else around. He was around at night as a teenager by himself. That didn't sit right in Shudo's gut, no matter the circumstances. Shudo approached the boy, his pale green eyes disappearing every few seconds as his eyelids pulled over them like a blanket. "Are you all right?" he asked, the churning feeling in his stomach increasing with the verbal contact. The boy's hand that wasn't holding the cane reached out towards him in response, fingers twitching towards his multicolored hair. "Hi," the boy muttered lazily, fingers now stretching specifically towards the red-colored strands. He hesitated for a second before moving closer and crouching down, letting the green-eyed boy sift his fingers through the red strands. The sensation was like nothing Shudo had ever felt before in his life, warm and oddly nice despite the circumstances of how it was happening. He let out a breathy, "Hello," in response, content to just stay there and let his hair continue to be carded through by such thin, nimble fingers. Shudo would have probably been content to stay there all night if the other boy's hand hadn't fallen with a soft thud from his hair to the park bench below, his breathing even and a clear indication of sleep. So instead of just leaving him there like a reasonable person, Shudo took the green-eyed boy home bridal style like he was a lost kitten that needed a home. He set the boy into his bed and pulled out an extra futon on the side for himself. This was either the stupidest decision he had made or the best decision. Blinking back to the present with that thought still in his head, right now it seemed like the stupidest decision, Shudo's head whipped towards his bedroom door as the sound of footsteps downstairs became louder with each ticking second. His posture immediately stiffened and his face paled at the prospect of his father finding out he'd let a stranger into their house. "You have to go now." Midoriya opened his mouth, ready to ask why, to protest, but Shudo quickly cut him off. "There's no time to explain, I'm afraid. Can you climb out through the window and down the lattice with, your visual impairment?" Midoriya's nose wrinkled for a second at the mention of his blindness. Was it a touchy subject or had he been wrong in his assumption? "I'll be fine," Midoriya retorted. "But why do I have to go dash?" "No time." Shudo pulled Midoriya out of his bed, carefully placing his red shoes and bright yellow backpack into his lap that he'd set aside for the boy. "Quickly, put those on and leave. I'll try to stall, but I just hope for your sake that you're gone by the time I get back. Got it?" He couldn't let this innocent-looking teen get hurt too because of his mistakes. "All right," Midoriya stuttered out, pulling on his red shoes and flinging his backpack onto his back. Pulling open the window, Midoriya quickly scrambled through the narrow opening, green hair disappearing as he climbed down the lattice to the ground below. Shudo reached out for the door handle, ready to open it and face the wrath on the other side when it swung open from the other side. He could feel the heat coming off of his father as his face appeared on the other side of the door, brows furrowed in his perpetual scowl and beard of fire already twisted in anger. This was the certain mood Shudo tried to avoid whenever he saw his father like this. The kind of mood left from the strong scent of smoke after a night of crime fighting and a distaste for working with others. He could also smell alcohol on his father's breath, a clear sign that work hadn't ended well for father. Or perhaps he was just always this angry and drunk off his ass whenever he came home at 6 o'clock in the morning to beat the crap out of Shudo for no reason. He hadn't yet decided what the reasoning was, but no matter what the reasoning behind it was, Shudo always ended up the worse for. Today seemed like it would be no different. Father glared down at him, fist already reaching towards the white side of his hair and clenching tightly into the pale strands. "Shudo, why aren't you downstairs and training yet? It's already 6:15. His icy blue eyes were cold and emotionless as he slowly brought up his other hand not clamped in Shudo's hair and grabbed onto the upper part of Shudo's arm, fingers heating up until he could hear more than feel the sizzling of heat burning his skin. "I'm sorry, father," he murmured out, head bowed down as a show of submission. I had practiced later than I expected to last night and had not gotten up until 10 minutes ago. It won't happen again. Father yanked Shudo's head closer to his own until they were nose to nose. The pungent smell of beer was more prominent than it had been from 5 feet. He wanted to gag at the stench and the lividness in his father's eyes, but he couldn't. Not without getting in trouble, anyways. I'll guarantee it won't, his father hissed out, yanking Shudo out of his bedroom and through the house. We'll train through the morning and lunchtime. When you're knocked down, you better get your damned ass up as soon as I say so. Got it? Yes, sir. Louder. Father rumbled out, his tone darkening with rage. Yes, sir. He'd been wrong. Today felt like it was going to be worse than his father's usual hissy fit. It left a foreboding stain in his mind as his father flung him to the ground, then demanded he get right back up and fight. Yet every time he swung, every time he dodged, every time he moved even a muscle, Shudo was once again subjected to the view of the wooden beams of the ceiling above. And every time, Shudo felt spittle fly from his father's lips and land on his face as he screamed at him to get up. To fight again. To fulfill the reason he'd been created. Black upon blue upon purple upon green upon yellow. Shudo looked at his chest in the mirror as sweat glistened on his skin. His stomach rumbled in protest from the lack of food. Training had ended mere minutes ago, just after 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Almost 9 hours of beatings and screams in his face, and all Shudo felt was numb. He should have felt pain or anger or fear or sadness or anything except this lack of feelings and haziness that filled his head. As he watched his expressionless face in the mirror, he wondered if he ever would. Midoriya Izuku stood once again in front of Yui Academy, his tie, hopefully, knotted neatly around his neck and his signature backpack slung onto his back. A new pair of thick-rimmed glasses sat askewadly on the tip of his nose, and his cane was tucked neatly into the bottom of his bag out of sight. It was always good to have it with him, just in case. Izuku's heart fluttered anxiously as he slowly walked towards his new school. Should he be excited? Nervous? Scared? All three? He wasn't sure how he felt, and that indecisive feeling continued to grow with each step he took. And then his foot caught on an edge in the sidewalk he'd somehow failed to notice. As Izuku fell, all he could think was how fitting of a start to his high school career this was. He squeezed his eyes closed and tensed up as he waited for the pain of the hard concrete meeting his body, but instead was met with the feeling of weightlessness. Oh good. I caught you in time, chirped out a cheery voice that Izuku felt like he recognized, but he wasn't sure until the outline of her body was filled in by his quirk. It was the girl he'd saved from that giant robot in the practical exam. I was worried you'd fall flat on your face there for a second. She let out a nervous giggle as she took him by the arm, set him upright, then pressed her fingers together and whispered out a quiet, "Release." Instantly, Izuku felt the weight of his body return as his feet were once again acquainted with the ground. "Thank you," he stuttered out. The girl let out another soft laugh. "It was no problem at all, though I'm sorry about using my quirk on you without your permission. Falling isn't really the best way to start your first day of high school. I'm glad that you're okay." She stuck out her hand towards him, and he took it without a moment's hesitation. "I'm Uraraka Ochako. I hope we can become great friends." "Midoriya Izuku," he stuttered out after a second. Although Izuku couldn't see it, he could practically feel the beaming smile Uraraka had on her face. "Wanna find our classes together, Midoriya? I'm in Class 1A. What about you?" She swung her hands as she skipped into the building and down the hallways. Izuku had to shuffle along at a faster pace than he usually had just to keep up. "I am also in C Class 1A. Dang. Why was his voice stuttering so much today?" Uraraka clapped her hands in excitement. "That's great. I'm so happy to have a classmate like you." Izuku flushed from the compliment, a rosy red filling the edges of his vision. Uraraka was so sweet and kind to him, and he wasn't sure why. Was this how people acted when they thought he was normal? Todoroki still acted nice even though he knew. Uraraka finally stopped in front of an extremely tall door, a sign that Izuku took to mean that it was their classroom. She turned towards him, bouncing on the balls of her feet. "Are you ready?" A scratchy started in his throat and his tongue felt parched at the mere thought of having to interact with more people, but Izuku still managed to squeak out a squeaky yes, just before Uraraka pushed open the door. His quirk immediately started to compile information, a slight whisper of wind exuding off of his body and cataloging the surroundings closest to Izuku in more detail than what he'd usually pertain inside a classroom. Counting the number of moving outlines around the room, he estimated that just about everyone else had already arrived and they were the last ones to come in. The familiar outline of his childhood friend, Kaken, had his heart skipping a beat. He knew Kaken would get into Yui with no problem at all, but he'd thought the odds of them being in the same class weren't very high. His brash and loud voice echoed through the small classroom, eliciting stares and laughter alike. Of course, the ill-tempered teen had already picked a fight with someone. Izuku grinned internally at the thought. His explosive friend certainly knew how to rub people the wrong way in whatever he did, and putting his feet up on the desk was no exception. It is extremely rude for you to put your dirty feet up on the desks of such a high institution. I demand you take them off at once, spluttered out a taller man with boxy shapes connected to his calves. Izuku vaguely remembered seeing him in the same testing area as himself, but little else besides that fact. He wondered if they ever talked. Kaken scoffed at the other teen. I'll do as I please, Four Eyes. I don't need any lecture from the likes of any preppy rich kid. Scram. Oh great. The explosive teen was off to an even better start than Izuku had imagined. Just perfect. The boxy-calved teen was silent for a moment, as if contemplating how exactly to murder Kaken. Izuku wouldn't blame him if he was at this point. Instead of committing any acts of violence, he just bowed low once and stayed there for a second before bobbing back up in a robotic-like manner. I'm sorry if we got off on the wrong foot there. As you are going to be my future classmate for a few years, I think it best if we start over properly. My name is Tenya Ida said Scram. Kaken repeated again. I'm not here to make friends. I'm here to become the #1 hero and that's it. Got it? Before Ida could respond, or Izuku to reprimand his friend because that is not how you talk to other people, Kaken, oh my gosh. The door creaked open again to reveal a shapeless lump inching its way along the ground. Izuku immediately darted out of the way and sat down in the closest empty seat, which just happened to be right behind Kaken. The blob continued to inch forward until it finally stopped right in front of the teacher's desk, a hand darting out and unzipping the middle of what he now realized was a sleeping bag. The figure that slowly climbed out and stood up with a sagging posture and loose scarf was a figure Izuku knew. It was his verbal exam instructor. I know him, he whispered out. Kaken's head whipped around so fast that Izuku wasn't sure how the teen didn't injure himself in the process. Deku, he screamed. When the heck did you get here? Soon enough to see you arguing over something as petty as having your shoes on the desk, Izuku responded, a tiny grin appearing when a reddish tinge took over Kaken's face. Seeing red was fantastic, especially to tell whether someone was blushing or not. Shut up, Kaken grumbled out, and he probably would have said more if the exam person in front hadn't cleared his throat to get the class's attention. His childhood friend let out a few choice words, albeit rather quietly for once, then turned back toward the front with his ever-tense posture. The chatter of the class dimmed around Izuku until it was dead silent and everyone was facing towards the man. Hello, my name is Aizawa Shoyuda and I am your homeroom teacher this year. He pulled up his sleeping bag and fumbled around inside it for a moment before pulling out a jumble of clothing. He tossed it towards the nearest student with little regard. These are your gym uniforms. Put them on and meet me out by the training fields. No questions asked, no excuses. Now the classroom had felt stifled and condensed to Shudo, the low hum of his new classmates doing little to calm the rising panic in his chest. New environments combined with new people all in one day was something Shudo should have been used to, but this felt different. Different age group. Different expectations. Everything was different. Just as it seemed that his heart was about to burst out of his chest, everything froze for just a moment as Shudo's eyes caught sight of familiar green curls. His breath stuttered to a halt. It couldn't be possible. He couldn't be lucky enough to meet that mysterious pale-eyed boy again. And yet there Midoriya was, an exasperated smile curling the corners of his lips as he watched the angry blonde and that engine quirk boy argue with each other. Something was different though. As Shudo peered closer, he realized that Midoriya had neither his cane nor his sunglasses with him. Instead, his hands were empty and caramel-colored glasses were perched on the tip of his nose. Why would he be wearing glasses if he was blind? Unless he didn't want to be seen as blind. Shudo couldn't understand where that thought came from, but it left him even more confused than before. There was nothing wrong with being blind. Perhaps Shudo would catch Midoriya later in the day and ask him. Now, the homeroom teacher, Aizawa-sensei, was corralling them into putting on what looked like their gym uniforms and ordering them to go outside. Later, he thought to himself, he would talk to Midoriya later, when he could catch the other boy alone, and figure out what exactly was happening. Shoyuda Aizawa was tired and his trudging footsteps certainly showed it. But he had a job to do, and it was unfortunately teaching a bunch of teens that would more likely than not turn out to be another batch of brats that he could expel without a second thought. So instead of going to the entrance ceremony like the classes were supposed to do, Shoyuda had instead forced them into donning on the gym attire and coming out to the practice fields in what he considered to be a weeding of the week. Many of his coworkers disagreed with his methods, but it was just a little quirk testing. If Shoyuda didn't find out the limitations to his class's quirks now, then he'd learn them too late. He stood in the little throwing circle at the edge of the training field, his class as shapeless blob in front of him. He scanned each face carefully, not quite glaring them down but close enough to assert authority over them. His eyes snagged for a second on a boy with pale green eyes hidden behind thick-rimmed glasses and curly green hair, but he moved on without showing even a glimmer of surprise on his face. Midoriya Izuku and his quirk-airy eyes. To say Shoyuda was pleased to have such a promising kid placed in his class was an understatement and something he'd never mention to anyone else if he could help it. Maybe this year wasn't going to be as tiresome as he'd originally thought. Line up! Shoyuda barked out at the students, and they scrambled to comply. Once they were in 2 neat lines, he pulled a baseball out of his pocket and threw it towards Midoriya Izuku. The kid's hands came up a second later than most would when a ball was tossed to them, but he caught it nonetheless. Today we're conducting a test of quirks with your previous gym tests, but in this instance, quirks are allowed and encouraged to try and get the best score you can. A bobbed-haired girl with wide eyes let out a small squeak of protest. But Aizawa-sensei, what about the entrance ceremony and all that? It's a waste of time if you want to become a hero, he retorted. Her mouth snapped shut quickly at that, as did many others. Shoyuda continued on with his explanation anyways to avoid any future protests. Yui is known for its mort freestyle education methods. This idea applies to us teachers as well. His gaze snapped towards the green-haired boy. Midoriya. The kid startled, hands fumbling to keep the ball grasped between his fingers. Yes? How far could you throw in middle school? Midoriya's eyes narrowed in thought for a second before he responded with, 56 meters. Shoyuda crooked his finger towards Midoriya and beckoned him forward. Try throwing it again with your quirk, but don't leave the circle. Give it all you've got. As Midoriya passed by Shoyuda, he tried to catch the boy's eye, but the boy just walked past him and into the circle as if he hadn't noticed Shuda's gaze at all. Could it be possible? No way, he thought to himself. There was no way he was right. After all, Midoriya could walk fine and he didn't seem hindered one bit. There was absolutely no way that Shoyuda was right. After all, nobody that was blind could move around this normally without any trouble. Unless Midoriya wasn't completely blind. Airy eyes. What a strange name for someone to give their quirk, as if it was their sight instead of their own eyes. Izuku held on tightly to the ball in his hand, his mind racing to come up with a way to accomplish this task with his limited use of short bursts of air. He had to make a good first impression. He had to show Kaken he wasn't a helpless little kid that needed protecting. Stepping into the slightly raised circle, he started winding back his arm to throw the ball, quirk working overtime to show every single detail Izuku could get out of his surroundings. He wondered if there was a way to use his quirk to see how the air currents were moving. Maybe if he concentrated hard enough. Izuku spotted a streak of thin, strangely colored strings tugging against the sky in beautifully curved patterns moving in the direction just slightly to the left of himself. Reaching up towards the strongs with the hand not holding onto the ball, Izuku pulled. And pulled. And pulled until the air current straightened out and was now flowing swiftly away from him. There was murmuring behind him as Izuku wiped the sweat off his forehead that had appeared and finally pulled back his arm and shot the ball into the sky, adding a bit of extra wind to the end to help it along the newly straightened air current. He sensed the ball for a while, riding the current like it was surfing a wave in the ocean, but lost feeling of the ball after it was about half a mile away. Aizawa-sensei's head swiveled towards him, his posture unreadable. He held a box out towards Izuku that he assumed was to measure how far the ball went. 1,200 meters. The teens behind him let out a gasp of awe as Izuku slowly walked back towards them, head bowed in embarrassment. Maybe he should have held back a little bit? Attention wasn't something Izuku seeked out, and there was a reason for that. That was so cool. What an amazing quirk. I'm not even sure what happened, but it looked amazing. Did you see how fast that ball went? It was like whoosh, then shwoom, and then it was out of sight. But these comments weren't what Izuku had been expecting. These comments were encouraging. Everything that the usual comments weren't. He felt his cheeks flush in gratitude instead of embarrassment as a few people clapped him on the back as he joined his classmates. One in particular with longer hair and a tall physique leaned closer and giggled. "That was amazing," the girl whisper yelled. Something metal touched the tip of his ear, and he let out a small puff of breath as he realized who was talking to him. "Thanks, Freya. It's nice to see you made the hero. Course 2. Izuku let out a genuine smile, happy to see the raspy-sounding girl again. "I know," Freya gushed. "It's so cool that we both made it and into the same class too. And my brother, Ferris, made it into the support department too, so it's even more exciting. This school year is going to be fantastic." Izuku opened his mouth to respond, but the clipped sound of Aizawa-sensei calling out, "Miss Stellar, you're up next to throw," had both of them lapsing into silence. As she walked over to the throwing circle, Izuku called out a quiet, "Good luck." Freya paused for a moment, turning around and sending a peace sign towards him. "Thanks." And then she was off, ball grasped tightly in her hands and shoulders pulled back in a show of what Izuku felt was false confidence. He hoped she did well. It wasn't often that Izuku met she a sweet person, although he might just have to change his view on the often-ness part. If he really thought about it, there was Todoroki, Uraraka, Kaken, he considered the angry teen to be kind anyways, Freya, and if how everyone had been acting today was anything to go by, everyone else in his class seemed super nice too. It left a fuzzy feeling in Izuku's heart. The rest of the assessment left Izuku feeling tired and his breaths hollow. He'd used his quirk more today than he'd probably done in a week of training with all might, and the backlash of it left his legs wobbling and ready to collapse at a moment's notice. Before he could stagger off to go home and sleep this exhaustion off, a hand clamped tightly onto his shoulder and held him back. The thick, shoulder-length curls and long, thin scarf made it clear just who it was. He turned around with a nervous smile on his face. "Aizawa-sensei, did you need me for something?" His homeroom teacher let out a deep sigh. "I'm sorry to do this to you, but I need to confirm something." Aizawa's voice was laced with what Izuku could only assume was remorse and regret, but for what he didn't know. "Sorry for what dash?" Izuku's voice cut off in a strangled yelp as everything around him went dark. All the shapes and outlines that he'd been constantly surrounded by with the combination of All Might's quirk were gone. Every stray breeze, every strangely colored air string he'd been able to see since this morning, this were all gone. All that was left was a suffocating darkness that had Izuku choking on his own spit and collapsing onto the ground in terror. "Give it back," he rasped out, fingers scrambling and pulling at his hair until he felt a grounding, dull pain in his head because of it. His legs curled in on himself as he lay there in the grass, tears prickling in the corners of his eyes. "It's all I have. Please." His vision returned a second later. Izuku sobbed out a sigh of relief as the familiar white outlines of his world returned back in their place and he could see once more. He didn't want to move though. Or rather, his body refused to, so he decided that staying slumped on the ground was the better, only choice. A voice spoke up above him, and it took Izuku a second to focus his quirk on the outline of Aizawa above him. I was hoping my hunch would be wrong. Izuku let out a harsh chuckle. And what hunch was that? That you were blind. Aizawa sat down on the grass beside him, sighing as he placed a gentle hand on Izuku's knee. I'm sorry. Turning his head to look at his teacher, Izuku let out a small snort. His heartbeat had finally calmed down from the scare of losing his quirk for a few seconds. Sorry for what? That I'm blind? That I'm useless without my vision? The sharp intake of air from his teacher had him questioning whether or not what he just said was maybe, just maybe, a little too self-deprecating. No, Aizawa responded gruffly. I'm sorry that I took away your quirk just to test whether or not you were blind. I should have just asked. So, why didn't you just ask? Would you have said yes if I asked whether or not you were blind? Izuku let out a non-committal hum. You have a point there, he admitted. It wouldn't have hurt to try though. I guess. Aizawa-sensei shifted himself down to the ground until he was lying parallel to Izuku, his legs crossed languidly in the opposite direction of Izuku's own. What are you doing? Izuku inquired, baffled by the older teacher's behavior. I have absolutely no idea what you're talking about. I'm just lying here in the grass, and if you try to tell anyone else anything different, I'll make your homeroom life miserable. Got it, kid? When Izuku had first met Aizawa-sensei back at the exams, he'd considered the man to be guarded and just a bit irritated at everyone and everything. While both of those things still seemed completely true to him, he also found the man to be secretly caring and protective of others. Of course, sensei. I won't say a word if you don't mention I'm blind. Aizawa scoffed at that. And how's that going to work, huh? You can't read. I'm pretty sure you can't write, unless it's in Braille. What are you going to do every time there's a test you have to take? You can't keep breaking glasses and hoping it'll get you out of taking a written test. I know. His teacher's head turned slightly at that. Then why pretend you're not blind? It seems like a waste of time to me. How did Izuku explain this? This helpless feeling that overwhelmed him every time he thought about telling someone he was blind. The pain and sadness of his middle school days and the bullies that had made his life a living hell, all because he'd lost his sight as a young child. Useless and weak and unwanted, the three things Izuku never wanted to be seen as again. Have you ever just felt waves of sympathy rolling off someone because of something you couldn't control? Or been bullied because of a physical impairment? Or just felt useless because no one trusted the blind kid to function properly without the use of his eyes? Izuku let out a bitter laugh. It isn't a good feeling in the slightest, and I never want to be put in a position where I feel like that again. Is it so wrong of me to want people to see me as a functioning, independent being? Aizawa was silent for a while after that. Izuku stayed quiet too, satisfied with watching the clouds shift in the air as his teacher contemplated what to say in response. After a few minutes of silence, he finally spoke up, voice tinged with guilt. It's not wrong. His mind blanked for a second at that. He'd been expecting a lot of different responses, but empathy was not one of them. What? If you believe hiding your blindness will give you the chance to help people see you as someone equal, then I won't stop you, Aizawa said softly. I understand completely the feeling of wanting others to treat you as an equal. However, I do have a condition if you want me to help you keep this a secret. Izuku let out a sigh of relief. Anything, sir. I would do anything for this opportunity. Silence. Then, tell your teachers as soon as you can, so they can help you out. And, while I respect your decision to keep this a secret, tell your classmates before the first year is up. That gives you at least 10 months to build up whatever independence you want them to see in you, but you can't hide the truth forever. It will just build and build and build until there's nowhere else for it to go but out into the open at the worst possible time. Deal? Izuku let out a shaky breath. This was better than nothing, and he truly did need the teacher's help. Deal? Bakugo Katsuki let out an angry huff as he shut the door of his empty household. His parents wouldn't be home until late that night, so he was on his own for dinner. It suited Katsuki just fine too. He considered himself to be much better cook than his mom, but the woman was too stubborn to admit it and give up her position as feeder of the household. That stupid woman's pride had left Katsuki and his father's stomachs many a times in bad shape after a particularly horrible meal or what he liked to call a typical Tuesday night. He turned on the stovetop as he stomped into the kitchen, opening the cupboard above it and pulling out a frying pan to cook upon. Luckily, Katsuki had bought udon noodles, soy sauce, and some vegetables on the way home from school, so a stir-fry was completely within his vicinity to make. He pulled out a chopping board and a knife and immediately got to cutting up the vegetables until they were minced into small enough pieces for quick cooking, but still big enough to pick up with chopsticks afterward. Katsuki did all of this on autopilot as his mind whirred through the day's events one more time. Deku had been in his class today, sitting just behind with that smug little grin of his and those useless glasses of his that he really wanted to take off of Deku's face and crush them between his fingers. The green-haired idiot had acted calm and, dare he think it, normal the entire day that it left Katsuki feeling as if he'd imagined the other boy being blind the whole time. But he hadn't imagined it, that he knew for certain. There were still telltale signs if Katsuki watched him close enough. He hadn't been if anyone decided to ask him. The nervous tick of his fingers whenever anyone got too close to his face. The way his eyes were always a few centimeters off whenever he looked at someone. The way he was always a second later to watch or notice when something was thrown to him. It left an ache in Katsuki's heart that he wasn't exactly sure why it was there. Did he worry for that idiot? There was absolutely no way he did. He couldn't worry for Deku because if he did that would mean admitting what Katsuki had spent years burying under anger and frustration, and there was no way he was going to willingly open that mess of shitty feelings he'd been trying to get rid of for years. That was a problem for a future Katsuki to worry about, not the current Katsuki. For now, he would sit down and enjoy some quality stir-fry that wasn't poisoned by his mom. He had plenty of time to psychoanalyze himself later. Or, never. Katsuki had been getting pretty good at killing off any emotions besides anger. Izuku sat on the cold park bench, cane laid across his legs in an attempt to seem casual, but he felt like he looked anything but casual. Sweat had started to accumulate on the back of his neck despite the cool night breeze chugging along in the sky. His free hand was tapping a constant 1-2-1-2 pattern on the wooden bench that did nothing to expel the worry in his gut. Why? The question was a simple one, Izuku supposed, and one that the boy sitting next to him should probably get an answer to. He must have had rotten, or amazing, he hadn't decided yet, luck to find Todoroki Shudo had also gotten into Yui and was in his class on top of all that. It wasn't that he was annoyed to see the teen again. On the contrary, he was ecstatic. And yet, you wouldn't understand. Todoroki huffed out a laugh at that, crossing his arms in annoyance. Try me. Izuku hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to start. Heck, he wasn't sure how he'd even told Aizawa-sensei earlier that day. A stroke of luck? A word vomit? Izuku had little of the first, yet plenty of the second, so it was probably just because of another word vomit on his part. But really, how hard could it be to divulge what he considered to be his greatest weakness and the reasoning of hiding it? Well, when he put it that way, it just sounded stupid. Was he overanalyzing it again? That also seemed to be a problem of his. Midoriya? You're mumbling. Izuku felt his face flush heavily at the pointed out fact. He immediately started to stutter out an explanation. Oh, I'm sorry. It's a bad habit of mine. I'm not exactly as sure how to explain this. I guess I'm a bit self-conscious that I'm blind, if that makes sense. I don't like people knowing what my biggest weakness is and, I guess lying about it was the only solution I could come up with. The glasses, Todoroki cut in helpfully. A tiny grin curled at Izuku's lips. Why's? Exactly that. A sigh escaped through his lips as he thought about the implications of what he was so happy about a moment earlier. I don't like lying though, despite what it might look like with my actions. Izuku growled in frustration. How did he describe this crushing feeling that threatened to overwhelm him every time he wanted to tell someone he was blind? Todoroki's fingers wrapped around Izuku's shoulder, giving it a comforting squeeze. You just don't want others to see you as something less or different because of something you can't control. So the other teen did get it. Yes. Okay. Izuku felt his eyes widen at that. Okay. Todoroki shrugged in response, hesitantly asking, "We're friends, right?" "Of course." Izuku immediately responded, even as his heart was thumping wildly at the implication. Friends? With him? He wanted to laugh giddily at the prospect that this amazing person wanted to be friends with him of all people. It left a warm, fuzzy feeling in his heart that he hoped never went away. "Then my answer is okay. It's your thing to tell, not mine, and I respect that. That's what friends do, right?" Izuku let out a content sigh in response. A gigantic smile spread across his face. "Yeah," he hummed out. He had a feeling Todoroki and he would become great friends, and this seemed like a good start to a long friendship to come. If anyone were to ask, Bakugo Katsuki was in fact not stalking Deku. He just happened upon the green-haired boy while he was on a midnight jog. It's totally not that he'd seen Deku leave his house at 11:37 p.m. and decided to follow him out of curiosity. Oh, he wasn't fooling himself, and if anyone found him, his excuse wouldn't fool them either. So sue him for being curious and also simultaneously worrying about his reckless childhood friend. If the idiot was going to take a casual stroll around the city at frickin' midnight when drug deals happened, then Katsuki was going to try his damned hardest to make sure said person didn't die in the process. Katsuki had stayed as far back as he could while still keeping Deku in his sights, wary of the other boy's alarmingly growing quirk and its range. He'd also chucked a baggy hoodie on and a large-brimmed cap that he'd found in the back of his closet as an extra precaution. Everything had been going fine, well as fine as it could go when you're stalking someone, and Deku had even sat down on a park bench for a breather, giving Katsuki a moment's rest in a bush on the other side of the park. Except, a moment turned into a minute and a minute into 5 minutes until Deku's entire body had frozen then relaxed in a mere split second as someone had sat down beside him. And that's where Katsuki was now, crouching in a bush, trying not to be seen by Deku and what he dubbed the idiot's friend, and watching the two of them talk and laugh back and forth. The other boy's hair was half white, half red, a combination that Katsuki remembered seeing in class earlier that day. It was the half bastard that had shown off with his stupid, flashy ice quirk, but hadn't used his fire quirk at all, much to Katsuki's annoyance. How the heck did Deku know this scrub? They seemed quite familiar with each other, if half's hand perched on Deku's shoulder said anything about it. The sight left a tartness on his tongue that had him wanting to leave the area immediately and punch that bastard at the same time. It felt like a nail was being hammered into his head the longer he watched, and while it would be nice to punch the other teen, he didn't want to risk getting in trouble at Yui for any reason, even if that smug smile he swore he could feel on that bastard's face was just asking to be punched. Katsuki slowly stood up from the bush, turned around, and left the park to go back home. If Deku wanted to get killed by being out at night just to talk to it, he wouldn't kill half by his actual name, then so be it. It wasn't his problem. Nope. He could deal with the crap of being angry with Deku later, but was he ever really angry at him? Before Katsuki knew it, he was out of that ridiculous disguise he'd put on and in his bed, no shirt and just a long pair of boxers on. Glaring up at his ceiling, he tried, for once, to sort through whatever this second emotion was that wasn't the usual all-consuming anger. Author's note, what an emo. It was different, yet so similar to the sizzling flare of anger. It kind of popped and crackled at the worst moments, in Katsuki's utmost opinion, and left his face flushing a bright red at the most inopportune times. It left him feeling frustrated and lonely and just a bit angry whenever Deku, Izuku, even glanced at someone else for too long. Katsuki reached over to his bedside stand and grabbed his phone. Turning it on, he typed in the passcode and immediately opened a Google search. After several minutes of typing and deleting sentences, because some of them just sounded plain stupid to him, he finally came up with a question that didn't seem too dumb while also fitting the criteria he'd wanted to look up. I feel like throwing up and my face flushes whenever I see his stupid face? The results came up almost instantly, and with each word he read of the titles of the websites, Katsuki felt his face flush just a little bit more. How to know if you have a crush on someone. 5 ways to tell if you like a boy. Quirks and crushes. How to tell if you like a boy or just his quirk. Nadidists.com quiz. Do you have a crush on him? 54 insane things you do when you have a crush on someone. No 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 no. This couldn't be happening to Katsuki, right? This was all a big mistake. He didn't have a crush on that useless idiot Deku, Izuku. If he did, then every little thing he'd told himself over the years about the green-haired boy had been a lie. He wanted it to be wrong, and yet it wasn't. Apparently, if those girly teen magazines from Quirky Teens said anything about it. 1. Your life revolves around them. Okay, it wasn't like Katsuki's life revolved around Deku or anything. So what if he always wanted to know where that idiot was? Or that he always wanted to talk to Deku anytime he could without it looking overly suspicious? Or that he wanted to beat him and was maybe a little too over-fixated on every aspect of Deku's life? Maybe this one was right, but not in the crush way. 2. You've started stalking them online. This one Katsuki could say with certainty he had not, in fact, stalked Deku online. Ever. Only in real life, so it didn't count, right? 3. Your body will have annoying reactions. This was definitely a checkmark, but anything could give someone's body annoying reactions, like, say, a flu. Or sunlight, sunburns hurt, man. Or poison ivy. Have you ever touched that shit? Oh. It sucks, and the itching's just a constant annoyance. Like stupid Deku. 4. You start talking about them a lot. Katsuki could try to deny this one, but all he complained about to his mom was Deku this and Deku that, her words, not his. But what else was he supposed to do? That little bugger was always doing something to annoy Katsuki, whether it be forgetting his cane at home or beating him for the top score during midterms. 5. Your eyes slowly turn green. Was that churning, sickening feeling in his stomach Katsuki always felt whenever Deku, Izuku, started talking to someone else, actually something as petty as jealousy? Probably, his mind argued at the time it barked out an adamant no. Maybe Katsuki did have a crush on Deku, but he'd be damned before admitting that to anyone else. Freya Stellar was what some people called overly perky, while simultaneously looking as if she'd just been ran over by a truck and put on life support. She couldn't exactly condemn them for thinking that second part, even though her brother certainly would. With her washed-out blonde hair, dark circles under her eyes, the metal gas filter covering the lower half of her face, and the dark brown, almost black outline of her veins, she would have been surprised if they told her she didn't look like death. Of course, she never let those comments get her down. What was the point of living if she couldn't have fun and make sure everyone else was having fun too? Moving from America to Japan had been quite a culture shock in that department, to say the least. Freya knew that Americans were considered brass and rude compared to other countries, but she hadn't thought it would be so true. Since coming to Japan, not one person had sneered at her or gave her a nasty look in even the slightest way. It was refreshing to how her classmates had treated her back in Missouri. It wasn't good in the slightest, and she really didn't want to go through those memories again. Ferris seemed to enjoy it more here too. Their mom had given them enough money that they were able to rent a good-sized apartment with 3 bedrooms, one of which Ferris had already converted into a workshop for his inventions. The sound of tinkering was a constant in the Stellar siblings' household, and they'd already gotten their fair share of complaints about the noises in the middle of the night that neither sibling really bothered to correct. After all, Ferris couldn't stop being Ferris, and all inventors knew the best ideas came at night. Freya had known even on their first night at staying in the new country that Ferris was going to get into Yui's support department without a doubt. What she'd been worried about was the practical exam for the heroics department that she'd be taking only a week later. Her quirk wasn't the worst, but it certainly wasn't the best by any means either. It had actually been her brother that had named the quirk Poison Control, back before it had evolved to become something much more than being able to consume poisonous substances without backlash. Accidentally drinking bleach and surviving had only been the beginnings of her quirk manifesting. It wasn't until someone had noticed the increased carbon monoxide levels in her room specifically that Freya had found out she had 2 quirks in one. In a way, she could inhale or consume any liquid or gas, but when expelled they lost a non-metal metal in the process. It made certain non-lethal gases and liquids lethal and vice versa, like with carbon dioxide to carbon monoxide and with the case of liquidized sodium salt to sulfuric acid, which was a great substance to eat at metal and destroy it, might she also add. For Freya's dream of becoming a hero, It seemed like a fantastic quirk. Well, except for a tiny problem. It turns out, naturally breathing out carbon monoxide in a home that can't process carbon monoxide like her quirk can cause a bit of a problem, with a bit being a huge understatement. While her brother could protect himself with his solid light quirk, their mother wasn't quite as lucky with her light manipulation quirk. It had led to quite a few dizzy spells and, eventually, Freya's own gas filter that would constantly convert the carbon monoxide back into carbon dioxide. She wouldn't exactly say that her metal filter was uncomfortable. Well, that wasn't quite the truth. The heaviness of it had been quite uncomfortable as a small child. The design had been atrocious for a kid's lifestyle. Freya couldn't remember how many times she'd complained to Ferris about how stupid the filter was and how unpractical it felt. It was around that time that her twin brother had gotten into building items, for her benefit at first and then eventually just for fun. At the age of 7 years old, her brother had built Freya a metal filter far superior to any that other support company had made for her. The current model Freya wore, dubbed Halo 2.1, was barely noticed in Freya's daily life, except for when she had to eat. Oh, that was a whole different story right there that luckily had a simple solution. The amount of carbon monoxide that would accumulate in the air surrounding Freya was minuscule and caused no damage during a 30-minute period, so she was able to eat with little trouble and different people as long as she didn't breathe right next to them. Despite how much her mother and brother had encouraged her, she'd still felt quite uneasy going into the practical exam. Talking to that plain-looking kid though, Midoriya Izuku, had calmed her a bit though. It was always good to talk to someone else that wasn't her twin about what was troubling her. It left her feeling more in control of whatever was worrying her. As she'd sat through the explanation on the practical exam, she'd actually felt excited about the exam. Especially the part about going against robots. Ferris had helped her over the years concoct quite a few different liquids that, if kept in her mouth for a few seconds, would become extremely acidic and burn through most metallic substances. She'd even gotten the approval to bring her different formulas into the testing site, each kept in tight-lidded mini-metal flasks that were strung along her crossing belts like little bells. Along with her extensive knowledge about robotics and their wiring, courtesy of Ferris, the acids had worked like a charm. She'd burned through enough robots to get her a comfortable score of 35 villain points. With the addition of 30 rescue points she'd also somehow obtained during the exam, the memories were a bit blurry if she was being honest. When the acceptance letter had come a week later in the form of a hologram, Freya had never been happier in her life. Ferris hadn't gotten a letter though. No, the flipping staff of the support department had shown up at the apartment to congratulate him on getting on and also to ask a few more questions on the invention he'd brought in. She'd rolled her eyes at that, her hand automatically hiding the smirk that had started to form on her face. Ferris could be such an overachiever sometimes. On the first day of school, Freya had been nervous. Would it be like her schooling in America all over again? Rich kids could be such pricks. When her homeroom teacher had announced a quirk assessment test, she assumed the worst, mocking and teasing about how useless her quirk was. And while she hadn't stood out in any of the tests, Freya had made a friend. Or well, found an old one actually. It turned out that Midoriya had also made it into the heroics department and was also in her class to top it all off. What luck! All in all, it had been a pretty good first day. Freya had left Yui feeling giddy and ready for the next day of school. Well, until it arrived anyways and All Might showed up in a super awkward position through the door. Right about now, she was feeling pretty shell-shocked at seeing the number one hero up close. She forgot that this man was now a part of the Yui staff and would be helping out with training. I am here, coming through the door like a hero. He was wearing one of his older costumes that would have had Freya fangirling over excessively if it wasn't for the next words that came out of his mouth and struck fear into her very soul. Today we're going to be doing mock battles. Your costumes that you commissioned for are to the left. Make sure to put them on quickly and meet me outside. Your future awaits. Well, this wasn't going to end well for Freya. That much she could say with certainty. Izuku just had a feeling this was a terrible idea, like a truly, might be the worst thing to ever happen kind of idea. He couldn't see the look on Kaken's face, but he felt that the feeling was mutual between them. Kaken's posture was tense and rigid as he was paired up with Ida, and then it stiffened even more, if that was even possible, when his team was drawn to fight against Izuku and Freya. "You're going down, Deku," he growled out, shoving roughly into Izuku's shoulder as he passed him on the way to the locker rooms. He had a medium-sized metal briefcase in his right hand, similar, if not looking identical on the outside, to the one in Izuku's left. He decided to ignore the angsty teen for now, opting instead to quicken his pace to the locker rooms where he needed to change also. Just before the names had been drawn for the teams and matchups in the classroom by All Might, Izuku had been silently fanboying that his hero and mentor was going to be in charge for some of their heroics lessons. He'd also told them about how their costumes were in, and as soon as everyone had his or her assignment, they were to go put them on in the locker rooms. He wasn't sure how exactly his costume would turn out, considering he couldn't have actually handed them a paper with exactly his specifications. Instead, he'd had his mother help compile a list of things that were important to keep in mind with the outfit with his quirk, and had crossed his fingers and hoped for the best. Setting the briefcase down on one of the locker room benches, he reached down, unclicked the clasps keeping the case closed, and pulled the lid up in a fluid motion. His quirk immediately began assessing the contents in the box, each one mapped out in solid white lines in their little apartments. A smile curled onto Izuku's face as he recognized some of the accessories stored in there. A foldable staff and goggles were the first two items he recognized and was pretty happy about too, if he was being honest. The staff would not only make it easier to generate air during combat, it would also bring a sense of security to himself too, similar to his canes he supposed. The goggles would also act as something similar to his sunglasses and glasses, yet their design was also a lot different. While the lenses did have glass in them, the rest of the design of them was similar to those of swimming goggles but with a more steampunk-like design to them. The back strap felt like smooth leather and had a tool that adjusted the width of the goggles to fit the user's head. The last accessory in his case was a metal meshed mouthguard, the spacing between the wiring small enough to keep a structural support to it and also have it small enough that bugs couldn't fly in and get trapped there. All in all, it was a respectable costume as far as accessories went. Now to the main part of his costume. Just by feeling the fabric of the costume, Izuku just knew it was perfect. The suit was a one-piece and felt to be skin-tight, but the actual fabric itself was what made his heart speed up in excitement. Underneath his fingers, he could feel tiny, pore-like holes in the fabric, small enough that it wasn't noticeable, but big enough to let the air that now naturally flowed off of Izuku's boy out in a steady stream. The gloves that went with the suit were also made of the same fabric, but were built with a little more padding to help lighten the backlash on his arms. His boots were thick-soled and also padded. Izuku had a feeling this might change in the future if he gained more control of his quirk, but for now it was safety first for his feet. He'd stepped on too many pieces of glass to think otherwise for his first pair of hero boots. Izuku tugged on his boots and was out the locker room door, goggles already placed snugly on his face and mouthguard hanging around his neck. He felt pretty badass, but the feeling didn't last long as he heard someone snort behind him. He immediately pouted, turning around to face Todoroki Shudo. "What are you laughing at?" Izuku faked whined out. Todoroki just walked past him, letting out a non-committal hum in the process. "Oh, nothing. It's just..." He paused there, face finally turning fully towards Izuku. His shoulders were back and looked relaxed, which probably meant he was maybe also smiling just a little bit. Izuku wished he could see Todoroki's smile. "Your boots are on the wrong feet," he stated slyly, then just walked off, shoulders shaking as if he was trying to hold in a laugh. For a second Izuku thought the other boy had been joking because surely he wasn't stupid enough to put freaking rubber boots on and get them on the wrong foot, but of course they were on wrong. Of course he made a fool of himself in front of his new friend. Man, today wasn't starting so well. Should he fake a sickness and just leave? It seemed like there was worse ideas that could go down today than leaving school early at this rate. He slid to the ground and quickly switched the boots so they were on the correct foot, glad that the lacings were easy to tie. Just as he stood up and started walking out towards where the mock battles were being held, he sensed another presence coming up to him from behind. "Oh good. I caught up to you." Freya wheezed out as she stretched her back and took a deep gulp of air to steady for breaths. "All the other girls are already out there, so I'd assumed the boys were too, but I'm glad that I caught you. I really wanted to go over some battle plans. Oh, sure, Izuku stuttered out. How could he say no to such an eager and honest-sounding girl? As they walked out to the training grounds, they exchanged ideas back and forth, slowly building up what some would call a plan, but Izuku called just plain suicide. This isn't a good idea. Freya laughed at that, reaching behind her to tie a leather strap around her hair to keep it back. Of course it isn't, silly. That's why Bakugo and Ida won't ever see it coming. It's so bad of an idea that it's actually good by default. That's not how it works. Pretty sure it is, she retorted, sticking her tongue out for good measure. Izuku would have said something back, because it really was a truly idiotic plan that only someone who was begging for death would ever even try in the first place, but All Might was beckoning them over with an overly enthusiastic shout for them to join the rest of the class so that the trials could begin. Okay, All Might belted out. The rules are simple. One team will be the villains and the other will be the heroes. Our first two teams up will be Team Midoriya, which will be the heroes, and Team Bakugo, which will be the villains. The villains will be given 5 minutes to hid their nuclear bomb from the heroes. The heroes will go in once the villains' time is up and will be given 10 minutes to either capture the villains with capture tape that I will provide or by touching the bomb that is, of course, just a prop for this exercise. He handed the capture tape to Izuku and Freya, then gave the fake bomb over to Ida and Bakugo. He also handed both teams earpieces for communication. Izuku put his on right away, the cool plastic fitting perfectly around his ear. Judging by how easily Ida carried the bomb, it was most likely hollow and extremely light at the top, with its only weight being at the bottom for a semblance of stability. If Izuku was going to take this scenario as seriously as he could, which meant not knocking over the nuclear bomb with his wind because that could end them all, then the only way they could win was, unfortunately, with Freya's amazing and totally not suicidal and idiotic plan. She had named it, not him. The rest of the students and I will be going over to the opposite building and into a surveillance room, so we can watch every second of the battle and evaluate everyone's performances afterwards. The villains will have 5 minutes starting now. All Might's voice echoed in the tight-nettedness of the surrounding empty buildings as Ida and Bakugo rushed into the designated mock battle building. The rest of the students followed All Might into the building right across the way, their excited chatter fading after a minute or so. You ready to execute Freya's amazing and totally not suicidal and idiotic plan, or what I call FATSIP for short? Izuku could just feel the excited energy exude off of her and couldn't help smiling in return. Freya reminded him of a puppy in a good way with how much she bounced around. Because dying seems like a nice thing to do today, he shot back with a small laugh. Oh, come on, Freya huffed out. As long as you don't stop puffing air off of your body, you'll be totally fine. And the effects of my quirk on Bakugo and Ida will most likely not be permanent. Her voice, while enthusiastic, held an air of questioning to it. Most likely, he muttered out. She let out a breathy laugh as she took off her mask and left it hanging around her neck. Izuku wondered how heavy it was. Her voice immediately sounded clearer and less scratchy. It'll be fine. Ferris helped me concoct this little gas a few years back so that when it combined with my carbon monoxide, it would create a fast-acting way to knock out opponents. Of course, the materials for it aren't cheap, but I feel like this is a good reason to use it. Her hands reached down and plucked off one of the flasks hanging off the dual belts slung around her waist. With extreme care, Freya attached the flask onto a side connector of her mask until a satisfying click sounded through the air. After another minute of fiddling, she slid the mask back on, tightening the side straps with ease. All set and ready to activate once I get to Ida. She gave him a sly glance from the side. You never did explain why I couldn't use it on Bakugo too. Care to explain now? Izuku hesitated. It's complicated. He could practically feel the smirk creeping onto Freya's lips. Complicated how? Luckily, Izuku was saved from answering by All Might's voice booming across the empty street. Your 10 minutes start now, heroes. Go, go, go. They both jumped into action at that, scrambling to get into the building and find the nuclear bomb as quick as they could. Speed would be essential against Kaken because if his childhood friend was going to do what Izuku thought he would, Then Freya needed to get out of here as soon as possible. Go find the stairs. If I know anything about Kaken, it's that he'll want to keep the bomb on the top floor. Go now before he finds us. With a brisk nod, Freya fled the opposite direction of Izuku at the next intersection, her long legs quickly eating up the hallway distance to the next corner until the sound of her footsteps faded into silence. Izuku kept his own footsteps as light and airy as he could, sensing that Kaken was somewhere close by, but unable to spot him yet with his quirk. The amount of turns and corners in this place sure messed with his quirk's ability to spot other people. He had a feeling that he wouldn't sense Kaken until it was too late, so he'd have to rely on his hearing a bit more than usual if he wanted to get the jump on the other team. After walking around for a minute or so and even climbing the stairs up to the second level after checking every room, Izuku could finally hear the soft squeak of brand new boots up ahead to his right, his quirk filling in the outline of the person a second later to reveal Kaken, his arms engulfed in large gauntlets that seemed just a tad bit over the top, even by Kaken's standards. Izuku only had one shot to get this right and he had to do it now. He pulled against the slight air current behind Kaken as he started to walk around the corner, causing him to stumble for a second right into Izuku and his capture tape. With a quick and fluid move, Izuku knotted the tape around the other teen's arm. Kaken just stood there, looking from the capture tape on his arm and up to Izuku's face in rapid movements that he could only classify as being shock. Wadash! The loud voice of All Might cut off the rest of Kaken's sentence. And both Bakugo and Ida are captured mere moments from the other. What a clean sweep by Team Midoriya. All Might's voice faded away as Izuku watched Kaken slowly grip onto the capture tape and rip it off his arm, fingers deftly blowing up the remains of the tape with a snarl. What the hell, Deku? What kind of petty trick did you just pull? Whatever remained of the joy of his and Freya's victory fled in the single instant it took Kaken to pin him up against the wall, breath hot against his face as fear flooded into Izuku's system. Kaken, Izuku bleated out. The trial is already over. Let me go. The teen's grip only tightened in response for a second before letting Izuku crash to the floor. Izuku winced, rubbing his back that had taken the brunt of the fall. Kaken loomed over him, palms faced up and already crackling with sparks. You're not leaving until we have a proper fight, Deku? I spent 15 years thinking you were useless. Stand up and prove to me that I was wrong. Each word was snarled and so full of anger that it left Izuku with a sickening sense of worry, for himself and for Kaken. But I don't want to fight you. Izuku slowly stood up as to try and not anger Kaken further, but only found himself back on the floor for his efforts, a hand clutching tightly onto his now throbbing jaw. Did you just punch me? I damn well did. He could just feel Kaken's manic grin. Now get up and fight me, you useless Deku. And so that's what Izuku did, but he didn't get up to fight Kaken. No, he thought it might be better to go for a sweep at his legs first and then get up. After all, Kaken hadn't specified whether he had to get up first or if he could just go straight into fighting. Kaken let out a grunt of pain as he fell to the ground, and Izuku used that split second of advantage to get up and flee around the corner of the hallway. He had to get away, or who knew what Kaken might do when he was this angry. He heard Kaken curse up a storm as he ran after Izuku, yet his legs never faltered for a second until he ran into what was admittedly a gigantic dead end that completely shattered Izuku's plans of escape. Throughout all of this, All Might had been yelling for the explosive teen to stop and that they both needed to leave the building because the battle was already over, but Kaken clearly hadn't heard the pro-hero. Or he had and decided to ignore him, which was the more likely option and also the one that had Izuku feeling a bit more scared if he was being completely honest. Kaken had also been saying something else, but the fear of being cornered had muffled the air around him until everything sounded like his ears had been stuffed with cotton. The only warning his got was Kaken's right hand coming up and resting on his left arm gauntlet and then the solid white outline of a grenade-like metal pin falling to the ground. The red that blasted towards him seemed muted and almost pretty. Izuku reached out a hand towards the crashing of colors towards him, only finally registering what it actually was as pain laced through his body and felt like someone had set him on fire, maybe because Kaken actually had. The last thought that ran through Izuku's brain was, this can't be good, and then everything went black. Katsuki stared down in horror at the twitching body of Midoriya Izuku. He hadn't meant to go that far, really. He'd even shouted out a warning in advance, and yet here they were. Guilt immediately swept through Katsuki as All Might arrived at the scene, cell phone already in his hand as he called for help. He gazed at his hands with unseeing eyes as he felt tears well up in his eyes. No, this wasn't how it was supposed to go down. Not the quick takedown nor the broken body he'd left in the wake of his anger and confusion. As Izuku was taken away on a stretcher to be healed by Recovery Girl, Katsuki couldn't help but feel ashamed for his actions. Unable to look All Might in the eye, he choked out a mumbled, "I'm sorry," then fled the scene before the pro hero could see the hot, angry tears that had begun to stream down Katsuki's face. Destruction and anger. Katsuki laughed bitterly at his predicament as he finally reached the locker rooms and could slide to the ground without anyone seeing him break down completely. They seemed to follow him everywhere he went, no matter how far he tried to keep Izuku from it. Izuku hadn't been this useless one of the two of them. No, that title had always been Katsuki's, and he knew it too. How stupid could someone be to harm the one they love out of fear of hurting their heart? Or was it from the fear of getting his own heart hurt? Katsuki wished he knew. Todoroki Shudo felt helpless as he watched Midoriya and Bakugo fight in the monitor hanging upon the wall. It wasn't until he saw the burst of fire that the feeling escalated into full-blown panic. He thought Midoriya would have dodged the blatant attack or at least used his quirk to lessen the blow, but he hadn't. Midoriya just stood there, hand slightly reaching out towards the explosive blonde. He watched as Midoriya's hand became engulfed in the crackling explosion. And then his elbows, his chest, his legs, his face. His pale green eyes widened in pain as the boy finally realized what was happening. The green was quickly swallowed up by red and orange until there wasn't a single part of Midoriya visible as he collapsed onto the floor in a heap of smoke. A gasp left Shudo's mouth. This couldn't be happening. Was Midoriya going to be okay? He'd only known the boy for a little less than a month, yet he felt protective over the smaller boy in a way he would never admit out loud. Something about his innocent manner and sweetness left a pleasant feeling fluttering around his stomach and a calmness to his mind. But this wasn't calm. This wasn't pleasant in the slightest. This was torture to watch, and he could only imagine the screams and pain that had been left in the wake of Bakugo's explosion. He didn't want to imagine it, but his mind had ideas of its own. Shudo felt queasy and faint as his legs seemed to get the memo and finally started moving towards the building across the way. He could barely feel the pain in his knees as he thudded to the ground next to Midoriya's collapsed body. A strangled cry escaped Shudo's throat as his multicolored eyes grazed over the smaller boy's body. There wasn't a section of skin that wasn't covered in either blackened spots or red blistering, bubbling remnants of whatever skin was left after the point-blank explosion. The wounds were shallow in most places, even with how painful they might have looked. What really had Shudo's face paling in fear and his voice screaming out hoarsely for help was the small slivers of white peeking through the charred muscles and blood vessels on Midoriya's hands. Tears had sprung into his eyes as he realized with a sickening lurch that the slivers of white were bone. A hand was placed softly on his shoulder as Shudo finally registered the other sounds in the room. Looking up through teary eyes, he saw All Might there. The pro hero was on his phone, urgently calling for medbots to arrive as quickly as they could and bring Midoriya to Recovery Girl. Flicking the phone shut with a weary sigh, All Might turned his gaze to Shudo and gave him a slight smile. "Everything will be all right, my boy." The next hour was a blur to Shudo. As soon as the medbots showed up with the stretcher, All Might gently placed Midoriya onto it and the bots left for Recovery Girl's office. Shudo's feet automatically moved to follow them. All Might held him back for a second, but as soon as he turned towards the pro hero with an empty look in his eyes, the man let him go without a fuss. He had to make sure Midoriya was okay. He had to make sure. He wondered briefly if he was okay, but shook the thought from his head as he huddled into one of the seats outside of Recovery Girl's office. He wasn't allowed in when a major healing was occurring. He stared at the wall across the hallway, eyes unfocused and brain practically shut down except for that one repeating thought. He had to make sure Midoriya was okay. He had to make sure. The creaking of the nurse's office opening brought Shudo to his feet in an instant and whipping around towards the person stepping out who just happened to be Aizawa. He wondered when their homeroom teacher got there. He immediately bombarded the man with questions. Is Midoriya okay? How bad is the damage? How much could Recovery Girl heal? Is he going to have scarring? Can I see him dash? Aizawa put his hand up, silencing the teen immediately. Geez kid, I didn't realize you two are so close. Shudo patiently stared at him, waiting for the older man to provide some kind of information. He wasn't in a position to be picky. He just wanted the answer to at least one of them. He let out a sigh before speaking once again. Midoriya is going to be fine. The damage was pretty bad, but Recovery Girl was able to heal most of third-degree burns back to how the skin originally looked. The places where Midoriya was burned down to the bone and the places where he had fourth-degree burns. She couldn't heal them completely over. Scarring is inevitable from such a point-blank range, and Izuku has the proof to show it. Aizawa faltered at that, opening up the door for Shudo. It's best if you see it for yourself. I need to go meet his mother out front to go over some things. I wouldn't touch him if I were you, but it's all right for you to be in there, I guess. Shudo muttered out a quick thank you towards his surly teacher before rushing into the room. He barely noticed the soft click of the door shutting behind him as he sprinted to Midoriya's side with tears once more in the corners of his eyes. Midoriya, he whispered out, slowly sitting down in a chair by the teen's bedside and letting out a shuddering breath he'd been holding in. Gazing at Midoriya's body left a rotten feeling rolling in his stomach. From head to toe, the green-haired teen was completely wrapped in bandages, the padding especially heavy around his hands and forearms. Even his face looked mummified with only the top tufts of his hair and his eyelids visible underneath the white wraps. He really hoped Bakugo would get what he deserved for hurting Midoriya. Midoriya's head slowly turned over until he was facing Shudo, eyes slowly opening and staring even more off than usual from Shudo's face. He was shocked to find that Midoriya was awake, especially after how much healing had just been done to him. Hey, Todoroki. He slowly reached out a bandaged hand towards the white side of Shudo's hair, giggling as the rough fabric carted gently against the teen's scalp. It tickles Todoroki. His face scrunched up in thought for a second before he let his hand drop to Shudo's cheek. Where am I? Go back to sleep, Midoriya. Shudo gently took Midoriya's hand in his own and placed it back onto the stark white sheets of the infirmary bed. As much as he wanted to talk to the hurt teen, he needed rest. Badly. Midoriya's mouth opened slightly as if he wanted to argue back, but all that came out was a soft snore. Shudo laughed quietly at how adorable it was. Slowly but surely, his muscles relaxed as he watched Midoriya sleep. Although he couldn't stop the boy from getting hurt in the first place, he could at least watch him now and make sure he stayed safe and didn't get hurt more or irritate his healing body. He'll be all right, dearie. Shudo startled at the noise and the sight of Recovery Girl right in front of him, candy held in her hand out towards him. Here, sweetie, have a gummy. Shudo took the piece of candy from her hesitantly and popped it into his mouth, chewing for a few seconds in contemplation before swallowing. Will he have any scarring from this? Only on his hands and forearms, Recovery Girl replied. He's very lucky that it wasn't any more than that. Although, she gazed into the distance thoughtfully before finally answering with a shrug and a mournful expression. I am worried that this might affect his quirk. His brow furrowed at that. Why would the burns affect his quirk? Recovery Girl sighed. His quirk, airy eyes, is made more effective by the amount of air his skin can take in and then release. Midoriya's costume even accommodates for this by having a very pore-like fabric that's breathable and allows air to move with little to no restriction to his skin. With practically every part of his skin being burned to some degree. I'm not sure how well Midoriya's quirk will work once he's fully healed. Bakugo Katsuki sat in the principal's office feeling both emotionally and mentally drained as the adults around him discussed his punishment. His mother and father were there, along with All Might, Aizawa, Mrs. Midoriya, and Principal Nezu. He tuned them out, already knowing deep down in his heart that whatever punishment he was given was well-deserved for what he had done. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Izuku's broken body burned on the insides of his eyelids, torturing and taunting him with his lack of control over his anger and pride. Katsuki didn't even care if he was kicked out for this. It was the least of what he deserved. Suki. Katsuki. Katsuki jolted out of his, admittedly, self-deprecating thoughts. He felt sluggish and tired as his gaze swept across the adults, all staring at him with varying levels of worry, from his dad to full-blown disappointment. It was a painful tie between his mother and All Might, for which one of those expressions hurt him the most. Like the intelligent being he was, Katsuki responded back with a completely oblivious, "Huh?" The tightening of his mother's fists at his response had Katsuki flinching slightly and inching as far away from her as he could without arousing suspicion. He averted his gaze from her to a safer target, his dad. His father let out a sigh. "We've decided on your punishment, Katsuki," he said softly, eyes full of concern as he gazed at his son. "Just give it to me straight." Katsuki looked straight at Principal Nedzu as he said this, nervous but also just wanting to go home and sleep for a million years like this day never happened, but it did. Principal Nedzu smiled slightly at Katsuki's straightforwardness. While in most cases this type of incident would result in an immediate expulsion, we have decided not to in this case. You have the potential to become a hero, and we believe there is a better way to help not just Izuku but also you through keeping you here. While you will still be in Class 1A, we have decided that for the immediate future, you are banned from out-of-school field trips and hero training in general until we deem you mentally fit to go back. Instead of fighting during that 2-hour block in the afternoon, you will be in anger management classes with our counselor here at UE. We believe that since this is your first and hopefully your last offense here at UE, rehabilitation is the better way to go. If you refuse or don't seem to be improving after a way, I will have no choice but to expel you. You are also banned from interacting with Mr. Midoriya Izuku unless he approaches you first, although I highly doubt that will happen in the near future. Have I made myself clear? It wasn't a light punishment by a long shot, but it still had Katsuki shocked that he wasn't getting expelled. He knew that he had anger issues, as clearly evident by today, so the opportunity to begin correcting his mistakes through that seemed like a dream come true compared to the other option. "Of course, sir. I'd thank you for this second chance." He felt tears spring into his eyes, and he blinked them back angrily as he looked his principal squarely in the eyes. "You won't regret this decision. I promise." Izuku's head felt woozy and his entire body ached as he felt the last dregs of sleep leave him feeling cold and uncomfortable in an unfamiliar setting. "Water," he croaked out, trying to sense his surroundings and find some for himself, but all that met him was an encroaching darkness. He couldn't see any white outlines amidst the sea of obsidian, and it frustrated him to no end. A cool surface touched the edge of his bottom lip, and he recoiled for a second before cautiously reaching out and grabbing what he soon found out was a glass that just so happened to also have water in it. The other hand didn't let go of the glass as Izuku tipped it back to take a sip before greedily gulping down the rest of the liquid, letting out a satisfied sigh as the last drops dripped onto his tongue. The hand moved the empty glass away before bringing it back once again full of water. Izuku drank this cup too. This process repeated itself 2 more times before Izuku pushed the newly filled cup back at the owner of the hand. "No more," he mumbled out. "Too much water." A deep voice chuckled as the hand pulled back the cup, and the sound of glass settling softly against wood greeted his ears. "Just tell me when you want it back then. You're not allowed to hold anything on your own yet, so I've designated myself as your personal helper for now." Izuku felt a warm smile curl on the edges of his lips. "Todoroki," he cheered out as loudly as he could with the raspy feeling in his throat. It wasn't very loud, barely more than a whisper really, but he decided to ignore that insignificant fact for now. It was the thought put behind it that counted after all. If he wanted to be loud, therefore he was no matter how loud it actually was. That was obviously how logic worked. "That's so nice of you." "Thank Y-." His voice cut off as his body decided to have a racking cough fit at what Izuku considered the worst moment for it to happen. His throat closed up and a burning sensation filled his lungs. Todoroki's hand gently pushed him back into the bed as he tried to stand up and take a deep breath. "It's not a good idea to move around with your injuries, Midoriya. Recovery Girl can only do so much healing at one time without harming the body further. Your burns especially were bad from what I've heard from her." Izuku glanced around in an attempt to try and hear Recovery Girl's footsteps, but he heard nothing besides Todoroki's body shuffling softly against the plastic seats and his and the other teens' breaths. If you're trying to find Recovery Girl, she's not here. She left about 10 minutes ago to get some of the paperwork she needs for the rest of your treatment. Although you should have been able to sense her with your quirk, right? Izuku stayed silent at that. How bad is it? Pitch black. There isn't a trace of white or red to be seen. Izuku's voice sounded bitter even to his own ears, so much so that he winced at his response. He tried again, this time attempting to sound smoother and less bothered. It's probably because I'm wrapped up like a mummy. Or, well, it feels like I'm wrapped up anyways. Izuku peered in the general direction of where Todoroki was sitting. Am I wrapped up like a mummy? The resemblance between you and King Tut is uncanny, the other teen replied back dryly. The two teens laughed at that for a moment. Well, Izuku wheezed from both pain and amusement, before the mood turned somber again. Izuku reached out his right hand towards Todoroki, wriggling it slightly so that the other boy would wrap his own hand around it. He couldn't feel the pain there, only a slight numbness up to his elbows, but something told him it would sting there like a bitch later. He decidedly wasn't looking forward to it. Todoroki took his hand lightly and placed both of their hands onto the stretchy material of the bed Izuku was in. His voice felt tinny and childish as he whimpered out to Todoroki, "Am I going to be okay?" In response, Todoroki squeezed his hands softly. "You're most likely going to have scarring on your hands and forearms, but besides that, Recovery Girl says you should be making a full recovery." Well, she's still not sure what's going to happen with your quirk, but she said it should be all right once your bandages are taken off. Izuku shook his head. "That's not what I meant, Todoroki." Todoroki exhaled out through his nose. "I know. I'm not sure if I can forgive Kaken for this. I wouldn't. But the problem is I want to forgive him. Can you believe that?" Izuku let out as bitter of a laugh as he could manage with how inflamed his lungs felt. I feel so stupid that I even want to talk to him again. What kind of person's first reaction is to hug the person who literally burnt them to a crisp? A crazy person? Todoroki guessed, his voice rising slightly at the end of the question. Izuku groaned at that. "I'm crazy, aren't I? I still resent him for doing this to me, even if I want to forgive him. Don't get me wrong, this was terrible and frightening and absolutely horrible of Kaken. But I still want to be his friend. I still want to know that Kaken is there to protect me, even if he didn't do that this time." The two teens fell silent at that, and a drowsy feeling began to fill Izuku up again. He let out a loud, blatant yawn that had Todoroki reprimanding Izuku for not going back to sleep sooner. "You need all the energy you can get," Todoroki huffed out, causing Izuku's lips to let slip a sleepy snort. "Stay with me until I fall asleep?" Izuku mumbled out. Todoroki squeezed the hand still clutched tightly in Izuku's injured hand softly. "Of course. I'm not moving anytime soon. I promise." The last thing Izuku could recall before he fell asleep was the light pressure of something pressing softly into the crown of his hair. Sleep quickly captured him after that, leaving Izuku in a black, dreamless state full of nothing but numbness and silence. Even before Katsuki could see the gates of Yui, he felt watched with every move. Glares and accusatory stares seemed to follow every step he took. A few people he'd never even met before bared their teeth at him and growled. He tugged the sleeves of his school-issued sweater down until no part of his hands could be seen, eyes darting around nervously at the crowd surrounding him. Katsuki knew he'd run into angry students, but he hadn't thought it would spread past the class of 1A. Maybe he shouldn't go to school today. Though, Bakugo! Yeah, he should definitely start heading home. He tried to shove his way out through the crowd, but a hand grabbed his shoulder and held him there. Bullshit. Turning around, Katsuki was shocked to see the familiar pointed red hair of one of his classmates and even more so to see a soft smile on the other boy's face. "What do you want?" Katsuki barked out, brushing the teen's hand off in a jerky motion like it was a spider or something equally horrifying. "I want a friend." The boy had such an open, eager look on his face that screamed honesty, but Katsuki couldn't understand why. Katsuki was rude and brash and so very angry. He wasn't what others would call friend material. He scoffed in response. You've come to the wrong person for that hair for brains. Try someone nicer. Like Midoriya or that stupid gravity chick? The other teen hesitated for a second before gazing straight into Katsuki's eyes. I think you've got the wrong idea, bro. I want to be friends with you. Now, Katsuki wasn't trying to look a gift horse in the mouth, but this seemed too suspicious even to him. Not only was Katsuki a volatile teen, he'd also severely burned a classmate less than a day before because of said anger issues. That anyone would want to be his friend after all that felt wrong. He didn't deserve any friends after the way he'd acted. Especially because of the way he'd acted. This wave of guilt pulled him deeper under with each self-deprecating thought that went through his mind. I don't need any pity from you, shitty hair. Take your stupid friendship somewhere else. The teen only laughed in response. Dude, that's why I want to be your friend. I understand what it's like to have no one there for you, and it doesn't seem fair to shun you just because you made one stupid decision. That kind of thinking isn't very manly to me, and I'm all about being manly. Did you not hear a word I just said? Nobody needs someone like me, and I don't need you. The teen extended out his right hand for Katsuki to take, which he ignored. He chuckled at this instead of yelling at Katsuki like he thought the other teen would. Dang, this guy was persistent. My name's Kirishima Aizawa. I hope we can become great friends. To say that Izuku felt strange felt like a gregarious understatement, but at least he wasn't completely mummified anymore. All that was left of his extensive bandages were wrapped around his hands and arms, the off-white material taped off at his shoulders. The skin beneath it felt itchy and bumpy and just wrong. Luckily, he would be able to get the rest of the bandaging off as soon as he arrived at school. If he would have been honest with himself, Izuku could have made it to the school already if he'd asked Todoroki for help. The teen had given Izuku his number after helping him home, stating that should he need help navigating his way to school tomorrow, all Izuku needed to do was send a text. But heroes didn't ask for help, so Izuku didn't either. The warning bell rang through the hallways as Izuku finally pushed the door open into Recovery Girl's office, only 20 minutes later than he'd planned to be. He heard Recovery Girl sigh as he perched himself at the edge of the bed closest to the door. I thought I told you to be here at 7:30. It's almost 8 o'clock, young man. Izuku shrugged and held out his arms for her to examine. Taking his palm, Recovery Girl gingerly poked her fingers into the bandaged skin. He winced slightly at the ache it left behind, but it didn't hurt as much as it did yesterday by any means. I got lost. She grumbled to herself something that sounded strangely like idiot, but before he could question it she was waving towards his torso. Take off your shirt. I need to take off the bandaging. Izuku did as he was told, laying the shirt beside him, and Recovery Girl got to work, carefully pulling off the ending tape and peeling the off-white bandages away from one arm and then the other. The cool sensation of air finally hitting the scarred skin had him shivering at how foreign it felt. Recovery Girl let out a whistle as she took it all in. Is it that bad? Izuku asked. His hands immediately started skirting lightly against the scarred skin in turn. The texture was a mottled array of rough and smooth patches with the smoother parts raised like a scattering of new veins. The raised hills of new skin pulsed in time with his heartbeat, and he wondered how exactly his arms now looked to those who could actually see. He assumed it would be shocking at the very least. Well, it's certainly not subtle by any means. There's nothing else I can do for the scarring, except give you this. She placed a squeezable bottle into his hand. Just rub this cream onto the scarred skin every night before bed and it should help with any lingering pain or sensitivity the skin may have to heat or cold. I want you to check in with me every few days or so too so I can check on you, okay? Okay. Recovery Girl picked up his shirt and placed it into Izuku's lap. Now put your shirt back on and get back to class. I can't have you dawdling around here all day. Izuku quickly donned his shirt and left the nurse's office, backpack gripped loosely in his left hand as he walked towards his homeroom. He was going to be late, but he had a feeling Aizawa wouldn't be too harsh to him after yesterday's episode. He felt bad taking advantage of that, but it wasn't like he was doing it on purpose. Izuku really did get lost after all. As his footsteps echoed down the hallway, Izuku supposed he should finally accept how much the new scarring affect his quirk, or more importantly, his sight through it. At first glance, other people wouldn't see a difference in Izuku's movements. Or at second glance? Or third? Or fourth? He supposed that only those that had known him for a while would realize there was any difference at all. With the combination of one for all and airy eyes, Izuku had been able to sense quite a bit farther around him and with more details. Now though, his sight felt clogged and foggy, as if someone had given him the wrong prescription glasses. Sure, Izuku could still see, but the details weren't completely there. It was like fog spilling out of a doorway, obscuring the view right in front of him, but leaving the rest of his surroundings untainted and perfectly fine. Perhaps if he'd walked backward to school, he wouldn't have gotten lost, or maybe he was just terrible at telling time. Izuku would always check his watch whenever he used the trains. He had memorized how long it took for the train to arrive at each of his favorite stops. It took 22 minutes to get to the shopping mall on the outskirts of town, 18 minutes for the stop at Yui, and a mere 12 minutes to his favorite park near where Todoroki lived. Instead of getting off at the Yui stop, Izuku had gotten off a stop early and had to walk the rest of the way there. He hated getting back on the train after making such mistakes. It felt like admitting he made the mistake in the first place, which he certainly didn't like to do. Izuku finally reached the classroom just as Aizawa finished reading off today's schedule. "Nice of you to finally join us, Midoriya," Aizawa drawled out, but Izuku couldn't feel any real bite behind his words. "Take a seat so we can get started, okay?" "Yes, sir," Izuku stuttered out as he felt a flush begin to creep up his neck. He may not have gotten in trouble, but it was still embarrassing to be called out by the teacher no matter the circumstances. He quickly sat down in the nearest empty seat, expecting Kakin to be in front of him, but he wasn't. In fact, once Izuku concentrated enough on exuding enough wind, he found Kakin on the exact opposite side of the room of him, shoulders hunched down in a way Izuku could never recall seeing. His childhood friend's posture was almost guilty, remorseful. But it was a look he'd never seen Kakin wear before, but maybe this was a good thing. Kakin had needed a wake-up call and he sincerely hoped this would be it. Izuku knew his friend was a secret softie and the anger was just a front to hide something else in his life. Maybe this incident would help Kakin realize just how unhealthy it was to bottle up his emotions. He hoped it would for the blonde's sake and for their friendship in the future whenever Izuku decided to forgive him. Todoroki tapped him softly on the shoulder from the seat behind him. "Are you feeling better?" he asked. When Izuku turned around slightly to answer him, he sensed more than heard Todoroki stiffen in surprise. He wondered why for a second. But then the teen slowly took Izuku's hands in his own and it all made sense. The long sleeves of his uniform had hidden the scarring up till now. "Your hands?" Izuku nodded. "The scarring goes up to just past my elbows, but I think it looked just about the same as what you can see on my hands." "Is it?" Izuku hesitated at this, but he needed to know. "Is it bad?" The sensation of Todoroki rubbing his thumb gently against Izuku's scarred hands left them tingling as if they were jolted with small shocks of lightning. He shivered but didn't pull his hands away. "It was strangely nice. I think it adds to that mysterious air about you," Todoroki finally answered after a minute of silence. Izuku snorted at that, but the bell interrupted him before he could respond. Mysterious air indeed. He was internally freaking out about this. What did he mean by that? Was it good? Bad? Or just something Todoroki had said offhandedly? It really ate at him too, but he was too cowardly to ask the teen what he meant. Todoroki let go of Izuku's hands as they stood up and left for their next class. A faint blush coated the other teen's cheeks, and Izuku had to hide the tiny smile that crept up on his face at that. He'd forgotten Todoroki had still been holding his hands too, but he didn't feel like helping to alleviate the other boy's embarrassment. It wasn't often that Todoroki blushed, that he had noticed anyways, so this was a welcoming and calming sight indeed. Before Todoroki could pull both of his hands completely away, Izuku impulsively reached out and grabbed one of them. "What, Ash? So I don't run into anything," Izuku blurted out, feeling his own face flush at his forwardness. "My quirks been a little sketchy, so I think this would be best FF for my essay safety. Congratulations on coming up with the stupidest, most obvious reasoning ever, ya dingus." There was absolutely no way Todoroki would believe him with such a lame excuse to hold his hand. The snort that left Todoroki's lips confirmed Izuku's thoughts, But the teen didn't say anything about it. He just laced his fingers in Izuku's and let their hands swing slowly between them as they walked towards their next class. Kirishima Aijuru wasn't sure why he'd extended a friendship invitation to the rudest guy in class, but some deep instinct inside of him told Aijuru it was the right thing to do. Sure, the dude had anger issues and possibly other issues to go along with it, but who didn't? Bakugo just happened to let those feelings get a bit out of control at times. Or, a lot out of control. Aijuru thought about being mad for Midoriya, and he had been for a few seconds after the explosion. The way Midoriya's body twitched with pain and then fell completely motionless to the ground had left him in tears, but then Bakugo had stared down at Midoriya with this look of... Aijuru wasn't sure how to describe it. It was like that scene in Big Hero 6 where Tadashi runs into the fire and Hiro just lays there staring at the fire with helplessness, screaming his brother's name. It was like that moment, but so much more. Tiny tear tracks had appeared on Bakugo's face, too thin to be noticed by anyone who wasn't paying attention. He had this dead look in his eyes, as if even he hadn't realized just how far he'd gone, like he hadn't meant for it to end in injury. It was such a wave of raw emotion that Aijuru couldn't help but also feel bad for Bakugo. It wasn't until Aijuru had spotted Bakugo just outside of the gates that he realized how much he'd hoped they wouldn't expel the explosive teen. Bakugo reminded him of someone else, someone who had been expelled for something that was an accident, and that small incident had changed them into a bitter and spiteful person. Aijuru didn't want Bakugo to turn out like that too, so he'd approached him with a bright smile and an unwavering faith that when he did walk away, it would be with a new friend. "You're completely crazy, dude." Kaminari Whisper yelled at him, trying his hardest to pull Aijuru to where he usually sat with the lemony blonde-haired teen with Ishido and Jiru. "I'm not crazy," Aijuru stated calmly. "Bakugo is just misunderstood, man. Whatever you might say about yesterday's fight, I know Bakugo isn't happy that Midoriya got hurt, and that's enough for me to want to try being his friend. We've all got issues, and I don't think it's fair to judge the man just because he's got the best of him yesterday. Don't you think so, Kaminari?" "Ugh, don't look at me with those puppy dog eyes." Aijuru batted his eyelashes again at the teen. Kaminari let out a disgusted hiss. Fine. We'll give him a chance, okay? Just don't do that again. It's creepy and way too flirtatious for you." Aijuru let out a victory laugh. "I'll go get Bakugo to join us. You won't regret this, I promise. He's a pretty cool dude underneath that gruff exterior. You'll see." And then he was off to find Bakugo and drag him over to the rest of his friends. Aijuru felt like once they got to know Bakugo, they would also see that more vulnerable side of the teen that he'd seen yesterday. "No. Come on, man. You'll have a lot more fun sitting with us than by yourself." Katsuki flared his nostrils at that. "I said no, hair for brains. Take a hint and leave." Kirishima pouted at that, and he wondered once again how he was in this position in the first place. Everyone else had either ignored Katsuki or snuck glares at him whenever the teachers weren't looking. One kid in their class, a tall girl with ashy blonde hair, had even flipped him off, her bright blue eyes piercing into his very soul as she glared at him. Katsuki hadn't even had the energy to tell her to fuck off. He'd just gone back to taking notes. He knew he deserved much worse anyways. This was child's play compared to someone else's reaction to his behavior. "Please?" Kirishima batted his eyelashes at Katsuki in what he assumed were supposed to be puppy dog eyes, but it only had him sighing in exasperation at how stupid the other teen looked. "Fine, but I'm only agreeing so you'll stop doing that freaky eye thing at me." Katsuki picked up his tray and followed Kirishima towards a table where 3 other people sat. While he was scowling excessively on the outside, he actually felt as giddy as a child during Christmas. Today was different than how he'd expected it to go, but this was definitely a good different, one he wouldn't mind getting used to. "When will we be ready, Master? All Might isn't going to kill himself after all." The boy glared down at his hands in irritation, but quickly schooled his features as he looked up at the computer in the corner of the bar. The screen showed nothing but a pitch blackness with the occasional crackle of static breaking up the otherwise monotone picture. The harsh sound of labored breathing could be heard through the mounted speakers on the sides of the monitor. "Soon, Shigaraki. Patience is key if we want this plan to work. The Nomu is almost ready. Dr. Tsubasa just has to tweak a few more genetic markers to make sure it doesn't try to fight us instead of the enemy. I'm also sending someone on the next day or so to get All Might's teaching schedule. It's imperative we catch him with the fewest amount of staff around, remember? Shigaraki rolled his eyes at that. Of course I remember, Master. I just want that stupid hero gone already. I don't get why they idolize someone who's done nothing but cause pain to others. The only way to end such blind devotion is to kill him. In due time, my student, his master responded smoothly. In due time.